And no, there is no free press, as some commentators have suggested, because many prominent liberal voices or prominent Democrats themselves identify as Catholic. You don't get a free pass just by calling yourself a Catholic. More than 1/5 of our country belongs to the same church as Judge Barrett. 1/5 of our country. Tens and tens of millions of Americans. All of them, like all Americans, must be free to live their faiths in diverse and different ways without being barred from public service. These kinds of aspersions do not become any more acceptable if the call is coming from inside the House. Sadly, none of these problems are imaginary. The American people's concerns are not manufactured. The Little Sisters of the Poor did not wake up thinking it would be good fun if the Obama-Biden administration tried to force them to violate their own consciences. These nuns did not manufacture their lengthy legal battle for the fun of it. It was the secularization left that went on offense. Churches all across America did not go looking for one of this cycle's Democratic presidential contenders to suggest places of worship should lose their tax-exempt status if they preach or practice traditional teaching. It was the secularization left that went on offense. If parts of the elite American left have become this out of touch with mainstream religious beliefs held by millions and millions of their fellow citizens, it will take more than victim blaming to dig out of it. They could start this week. They could start today. They could commit to evaluating Judge Barrett on her credentials and her qualifications. And they could stop gawking at deeply religious Americans like they've encountered extraterrestrial life or bought a ticket for a safari. Madam President, I understand there are 3 bills at the desk due for second reading in block.
The leader is correct. The clerk will read the title of the bills for the second time en bloc.
S4773, a bill to establish the Paycheck Protection Program, second draw loan, and for other purposes. S4774, a bill to provide support for air carrier workers and for other purposes. S4775, a bill to provide continued emergency assistance, educational support, and health care response for individuals, families, and businesses affected by the 2020 coronavirus pandemic.
In order to place the bills on the calendar under the provisions of Rule 14, I would object to further proceeding in block.
Objection being heard, the measures will be placed en bloc.
I move to
on the
proceed.
calendar en bloc.
I move to proceed to calendar number 554 S4675.
The clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to S4675, a bill to amend the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act.
The Assistant Democratic Leader.
I come to the floor today to speak to one of the most significant issues facing the security of our nation. It is a question of domestic terrorism, specifically the threat of violent white supremacists. In Tuesday's presidential debate, Moderator Chris Wallace asked President Donald Trump to condemn white supremacists and right-wing militia. President Trump refused. Instead, he replied, and I quote, "Proud Boys stand back and stand by," end of quote. The Proud Boys, a far-right group that promotes and engages in violence, viewed President Trump's words as a call to action. The group's leader, Joe Biggs, said he took the president's words as a directive to, quote, "F them up," close quote. I was appalled but not surprised by the president's words. He has a long history of inflammatory racist remarks. Now, President Trump claims that violence is a left-wing problem, not a right-wing problem, his words. Let me be clear. I join Vice President Biden in condemning all violence, but we know that white supremacists pose a great threat. An unclassified May 2017 FBI-DHS Joint Intelligence Bulletin found that, quote, "White supremacist extremism poses a persistent threat of lethal violence," end of quote. This was a finding by the lead law enforcement agencies of the Trump administration. They went on to say that white supremacists were responsible for more homicides from 2000 to 2016 than any other domestic extremist movement. The director of the FBI, Mr. Wray, in response to a question I posed in the Senate Judiciary Committee last year, said that the majority of domestic terrorism arrests involved white supremacists. Now, for years, I've urged the Trump administration to respond to the ongoing threat of violent white supremacists and other far right-wing extremists. Instead, they have repeatedly downplayed this very lethal and real threat. Attorney General Barr has never responded to the multiple letters I've sent asking what the Department of Justice was doing to combat white supremacist violence. Unfortunately, as we've learned from former Trump administration officials themselves, the Trump administration has downplayed the threat of violent white supremacists. Politico recently reported that a draft Homeland Threat Assessment report from DHS was edited to weaken language on the threat posed by violent white supremacists. And a DHS whistleblower alleged that DHS officials, including Ken Cuccinelli, requested the modification of the report to make the threat of white supremacists, quote, "appear less severe," and add information on violent left-wing groups. It's not enough to just stand here and condemn the president's remarks at the infamous debate. The American people sent us to Congress to act. There is something we can do now. There is something that we can do that will show we are prepared to respond to this threat to law and order, to this threat of violent white supremacists. I'm the lead sponsor of the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, bipartisan legislation that would address the threat of violent white supremacists and other domestic terrorists. Our bill would establish offices to combat domestic terrorism at the Department of Justice, FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security. It would require these offices to regularly assess the domestic terrorism threat and focus their limited resources on the most significant threats. Critically, they would provide training and resources to assist state, local, tribal law enforcement in addressing domestic terrorism threat. The House companion to my bill was introduced by my colleague and friend, Congressman Brad Schneider of Illinois. Just last week, the House of Representatives passed our bill on a unanimous voice vote. The Senate should pass it today. In a few moments, the staff will provide me with the language to ask for a unanimous consent. I'm waiting so that there's an opportunity for both sides to discuss the procedure moving forward. In the meantime, several of my colleagues have asked to come to the floor and address the issue. I would yield to them for comment or question through the chair. with the hopes that when the procedural language arrives, that I might be able to make the unanimous consent request.
Mr. President, Madam President.
The senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Madam President. We are here today on probably one of the most serious national security issues that we will confront. And I say that as a member of the Armed Services Committee, having received a variety of classified briefings on threats to this country, some of them regarding ongoing foreign interference in our election are truly chilling. But the threat to our national security from white supremacists now operating so openly that the director of the FBI has said they are one of the paramount threats, an ongoing security threat to our nation, demands action. It should be action now. The bill that my colleague, Senator Durbin, is offering passed unanimously by the House of Representatives within recent days. Let me repeat, passed unanimously by the House of Representatives, reflects the real and urgent danger of this threat. The President has refused to denounce white supremacy. The President has told one of the most prominent of those groups to stand by. That failure, an abject failure on the part of the Commander-in-Chief to respond to an ongoing security threat, demands this action now. We must stand up for the integrity of our elections, the security of our nation, and the fundamental freedoms that we prize as American people. We will not allow this cancer to metastasize in this country and thwart the will of Americans who are going to the polls. In effect, right now, ballots are being cast. The threat to our electoral will is ongoing. And so I am proud to join my colleagues who are here on the floor. We represent an ideological spectrum, as did the House of Representatives in unanimously approving this bill. The paramount threat to our nation and the integrity of our elections is white supremacy, violent extremism, nationalism that potentially jeopardizes the very pillars of our democracy. I yield the floor. Thank you.
Senator from Virginia.
The senator from Virginia.
Madam President, I rise to support the efforts of my colleagues to bring the unanimous House bill establishing legal procedures for dealing with white supremacy to the floor of the Senate. And I do so in honor of 4 Virginians. In August of 2017, a group called Unite the Right held a white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. They started on a Friday evening when Jewish residents of Charlottesville were gathering in synagogues and when students were coming to University of Virginia to start their academic careers. And they rampaged through the campus and community chanting slogans from Nazi rallies like "Jews will not replace us" or "blood and soil." As if that was not terrorizing enough, on the next day, they escalated physical attacks against many. Heather Heyer was a Charlottesville resident and paralegal with an amazing background and story who was peacefully protesting that day, and a white supremacist from another state revved his car up, hit her, and killed her. DeAndre Harris was a special education instructional aide in Charlottesville, and he was set upon by a number of white supremacists and beaten with objects severely. two Virginia State troopers, Jay Cullen and Burke Bates, both of whom I knew. Jay Cullen often flew me in a helicopter when I was governor, and I met Burke Bates, the trooper, because he was part of Governor McAuliffe's security detail. They were called out on that day, which would have been a day off, but they were called out on that day because they needed to provide extra security as this white supremacist rally ran amok in Charlottesville. And on that day, both of them lost their lives as their helicopter malfunctioned. And so I stand on the floor of the Senate thinking of these four Virginians, two of whom I knew, three of whom lost their lives and one who was injured severely in this Unite the Right rally, to say that it's time that we have laws in this country that would enable us to appropriately deal with the chief source of domestic terrorism. And for that, I thank my colleague and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Alabama.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Senator Durbin, for this bill. Thank you for the colleagues that are on here. You know, I was struck when Senator King rose in honor of those who died in Virginia. The list goes on and on. You can go to Emmett Till. You can go to the four girls, you know, Addie Mae Collins and Carol Robertson and Denise McNair and Cynthia Wesley. You can go to those that lost their lives in a church in Charleston, South Carolina. And the thing that connects them all is just not that they died because of the color of their skin, not just because of the white supremacists that were trying to change the political dynamic in this country. It's an unbroken string that goes back decades and generations. It goes back to the time of the great original sin of slavery, when white supremacy tried to dominate this country, and it goes back to a string of unbroken deaths that are occurring even as we speak. Hate crimes across this country have proliferated. And whether it's not just white on black, it's the Tree of Life Synagogue. It is so many things that we have to stop. And the interesting thing to me that what happened this week is that the day after the presidential debates, when the President of the United States refused to condemn white supremacy, the governor of the state of Alabama, my friend Kay Ivey, Republican governor of the state of Alabama, apologized to the victims of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing that occurred 57 years ago, an implicit acknowledgement that words matter, that statements of public officials have an effect on people. They give a green light to violence, often unintended. So this bill that Senator Durbin has proposed, that has passed, as Senator Blumenthal and others have said unanimously, is a statement that we cannot allow this to continue. It is a statement that we will, as law enforcement, as citizens and people in a free country, will put an end to this kind of rhetoric and this kind of hate. We cannot let this moment pass, folks, in this body. The House passed this bill unanimously, so should the United States Senate. We should make a stand with our colleagues in the House, Republican and Democrat, that this is an important statement right now, because what is unsaid so much right now is that we see this playing out in this country. We see it playing out in the streets. And we can talk about it from the right or the left, and we can talk about it from Republicans or Democrats, but the fact is we need to be talking about it in terms of people and victims, innocent victims. That's what this bill is about, protecting the lives of all Americans, regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of their religion, regardless of their political persuasion. This bill will do that. Give the FBI the tools necessary. Give the statement from the United States Senate that we will not stand for this. Support this bill. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from New Jersey.
I'm really grateful, Madam President. It has been said, and it is quite true, the only thing necessary for evil to be triumphant is for good people to do nothing. And here we are at a time where we know our history. Since 9/11, the greatest the greatest terrorism we've seen in our country. Actions from a church in South Carolina to a synagogue in Pittsburgh to a Walmart in El Paso. Time and time again, the violence that we have seen, the greatest terrorist activity since 9/11 has been domestic terrorism, right-wing extremists, the majority of them white supremacists. The warnings that we are now getting from our intelligence officials. I quoted one in Judiciary Committee hearing from the Department of Homeland Security. The most significant threat right now for the security of our country is white supremacy and violent white supremacy. The FBI has now given a number of warnings. We now are heading towards an election where we are seeing signs of increased activity, increased hate, increased focus. This body, this good body, friends on both sides of the aisle, this is not a time where we can do nothing. We must act. We must take measures and steps to end this kind of violent scourge in our country. Obviously, this will not accomplish everything, but in a time like this, we must do something. I join my colleagues in support of this legislation, and I want to again affirm the fact, quite encouraging, that it passed in a bipartisan manner in the United States House of Representatives. That is so encouraging. We should do the same here. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
Assistant Democratic Leader.
Madam President, first I ask unanimous consent that Senator Manchin's name be added as a co-sponsor to S3190.
Without objection.
Thank you. Madam President, we're asking for unanimous consent to pass a bill that has passed the House of Representatives unanimously, by a voice vote, unanimously, to empower and direct the law enforcement agencies of the United States to use their talents and resources to stop domestic terrorism, to stop the killing. We are identifying in the course of it the white supremacy and far-right extremism as one of the sources. Listen to what a Trump administration Department of Justice official wrote last year in the New York Times. Quote, "White supremacy and far-right extremism are among the greatest domestic security threats facing the United States. Regrettably, over the past 25 years, law enforcement at both federal and state levels have been slow to respond. Killings committed by individuals and groups associated with far-right extremist groups have risen significantly. We are not manufacturing a crisis. The Trump administration Department of Justice official concurs with our actions that they are needed." How did I get involved in this? It goes back to 2012. As chairman of a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee, I held a hearing on the threat of violent right-wing extremism after a white supremacist murdered 6 worshipers at a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. Officials from the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, and FBI, even at that time, testified about the threat posed by violent domestic extremists. When President Trump was asked and challenged to condemn this violence, he refused. The question is whether the United States Senate, now given the same opportunity, will stand as the House of Representatives has on a unanimous bipartisan basis to say enough when it comes to domestic terrorism inspired by white supremacy and right-wing extremists. And let me add, there is nothing in this bill to stop the efforts of those same agencies to police and stop left-wing extremism, all extremism. I have no problems condemning all of it, but we're focusing on the one that is the most significant in the words of the Department of Justice. And so, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 5602 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Madam President.
The senator from Wisconsin.
Reserving the right to object. Madam President, I just found out about this bill a couple hours ago. I've been busy, haven't really been able to really research it. And that's part of the problem with what our Democrat colleagues are trying to do here is just quick rush through the United States Senate. Now, maybe this has had a full vetting in the House of Representatives, but here in the United States Senate, it hasn't gone through any committee process whatever. Now, unfortunately, I also have to make the point, because I'm sure they're trying to make a political point as opposed to trying to make law today. I have to make the point that I am opposed to all forms of domestic terrorism, including white supremacists. I think I speak for all my Republican colleagues. I think I speak for every United States senator. We all abhor domestic violence and terror, including white supremacists. But the fact of the matter is, and again, I don't have much knowledge about this, even though I'm chairman of the Committee of Jurisdiction of one of the departments that would be subject to this piece of legislation. I know that department was not consulted on this piece of legislation. I've been given notice here that the Department of Justice does not support this piece of legislation because they say it would seriously impede their ability to work in the domestic terrorism space. So again, I'm not exactly sure why the Department of Justice does not like this piece of legislation, but suffice to say they don't. The Department of Homeland Security was not even consulted on this. As chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, I don't know anything about this bill. This is not the way to pass a serious piece of legislation dealing with this serious issue. Now, if it is a good piece of legislation, the sponsor should have no problem running it through the normal committee jurisdiction process. In this case, apparently this is Judiciary Committee. But I would think my committee would also have some pretty strong equities in this space, not to mention the fact that I've been working with my ranking member on precisely these types of issues. So instead of just trying to make a political point, what I've always tried to do is actually get a result and make law, but that has to go through a thoughtful process using the full committee process, which has not been the case here. So, Madam President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President,
Yes.
yes, I'm trying to make a political point. And it should be a bipartisan political point. It should be Republicans and Democrats in the Senate, as there was a unanimous voice vote in the House of Representatives on the same measure. I'm sorry my colleague from Wisconsin has left. The Senate version of this bill has been pending for 9 months. For 9 months. The House has moved their version of it. It is a timely issue. Why waste a day in making America safer? Why not tell our law enforcement agencies now, roll up your sleeves, go to work, find the most dangerous things happening in this country and stop them? And we know one of them is white supremacists and their right-wing extremism. The president fumbled and couldn't come up with an answer 2 days ago. Today, sadly, from the Republican side, we get an objection to coming together on a bipartisan basis, as they did in the House, to address this very real issue. I am troubled by this. It is a sad moment. I do believe the senator from Wisconsin and many others will say that they are against extremism. They had a chance to prove it by passing a measure here and refused. I yield the floor.
Madam President,
The senator from Alabama.
I am compelled to talk about this process that I just heard about. There is no process, folks. Let's just be candid. This Senate is not the deliberative process body that the senator from Wisconsin talked about. We don't have that. This bill's pending for 9 months, but we don't have that. This is not the Senate that I worked in 1979, where there was a deliberative attempt. There were debates on the floor. There were debates in committee. This is not a process. When someone says, whether it is on the floor of the Senate or whether it is in the media or wherever else, that this should go through a normal process, those processes have been killed a long time ago. I've been in this body for almost 3 years now. We've had only a relatively handful full of amendments on any bill that comes here. We've had virtually no markups in debates and committees. Those don't exist. And this bill has been pending for 9 months, which would have been more than adequate time for the Homeland Security Committee to take a look at it. More than enough time for the Judiciary Committee to take a look at it. More than enough time to have a hearing on it. Apparently, our colleagues in the House felt it was okay. But this body has gotten to be so dysfunctional that we will not allow a unanimously passed bill that's been pending in the Senate of the United States for 9 months to be passed, to send a statement The one thing I might disagree a little bit with Senator Durbin, for me, this is not a political statement. This is a statement about law enforcement, increasing the ability of law enforcement. It is a statement to protect victims of crime. That's what this bill is about for me. I've seen it all too happen often in my state and throughout the South. Again, that unbroken string. That's what I see this bill as. So I don't need lectures about process when I see a Senate that does not function, leapfrogging substantive legislation simply to ram a Supreme Court nominee through. That hadn't been pending for very long either. This is the kind of thing that the Senate needs to be doing and passing, and we should be ashamed of ourselves for not doing it. Hopefully that will change. Thank you, Madam President. I yield.
Madam President,
The Democratic
now
leader.
before I get into the subject of this pending vote, I do want to thank my colleagues from Illinois and Connecticut for their bringing this important topic before the Senate. President Trump's refusal to condemn violent white supremacist groups in the presidential debate. It's been around for several days. We've hardly heard anything out of most of our colleagues. And no one is going to buy the argument that it came too suddenly. White supremacy hasn't come too suddenly. The president's remarks have been out there for several days. It's the flimsiest of excuses to avoid criticizing the president even when every American of decency, the overwhelming majority of all Americans, would know he should be condemned. And they don't care if you're Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative. You never know how low President Trump can go. But his refusal to condemn white supremacy is among the lowest things he has done. And boy, oh boy, there's lots of them lined up. And I'm ashamed that my Republican colleagues, ashamed for America, for decency, have chosen to block this. Now, on another issue of great importance to America, the nomination of Judge Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court has thrust the issue of health care back into the spotlight. Her confirmation to the highest court in the land could put health care for hundreds of millions of Americans at risk. As you'd imagine, taking away health care is deeply unpopular with the American people. So it seems the strategy from the Republican majority is to invent some new distraction, a fresh outrage to talk about. My colleagues on the other side would rather talk about anything besides the fact that their president, their party, and their Supreme Court nominee poses a dire threat to Americans' health care. Today, the outrage from the Republican leader was directed once again at the idea that Democrats would attack the nominee's religious beliefs. But of course, in their zeal to manufacture this issue, Republican senators began telegraphing this line of attack even before a nominee had been named. One Republican senator wrote me a letter to warn against anti-Catholic attacks that happened yet against a nominee who hadn't been named. That's how transparent this Republican diversion, ruse, is. It appears that the Republican majority will crank up the outrage machine to any level of absurdity to avoid talking about America's health care, the health care so many Americans desperately want and need. In fact, all week, the Republican leader has mocked the idea that a far-right Supreme Court majority might strike down the Affordable Care Act and that Judge Barrett might play a decisive role. Of course, President Trump promised to nominate Supreme Court justices who would terminate the Affordable Care Act, and he picked Judge Barrett. That's the president's words. He's only going to pick justices that would terminate the Affordable Care Act. And it's no mystery why he picked Judge Barrett. In both major cases brought before the ACA, in both major cases brought against the ACA, Judge Barrett twice sided against the law. She publicly criticized Justice Roberts for upholding the law and said that if the Supreme Court read the statute the way she does, they would have to, quote, invalidate it. President Trump terminated. Judge Barrett invalidated. Guess what? President Trump and Republican attorneys general are in court right now suing to do just that, invalidate our health care law, in a case that will be heard 1 week after the election. The threat to Americans' health care is very, very real. And Senate Republicans are tying themselves in knots in trying to explain how it's not. Leader McConnell from the floor of the Senate called it a joke, that Judge Barrett and a far-right majority of the court might vote to take away health care or turn back the clock on women's rights. Maybe he didn't get that message around to his conference, because the Republican senator from Utah only a few days earlier claimed that the Affordable Care Act was unconstitutional and that striking it down shouldn't tarnish Judge Barrett if that's what she chooses to do. Another Republican senator said he wanted to see evidence that the nominee understood that Roe was wrongly decided, that Roe was an act of judicial imperialism. And I do believe Amy Coney Barrett's record bears that out. That's his quote. The junior senator from Missouri expressing confidence that Judge Barrett believes Roe v. Wade was wrongly decided. On the Supreme Court, Justice Barrett could enforce that view. So which is it, Republican leader? Is it absurd to think that Judge Barrett might strike down the Affordable Care Act? Or is it a good thing that shouldn't tarnish her reputation? Is it a joke that Judge Barrett could curtail women's fundamental rights? Or are Republican senators relieved to think that she thinks Roe v. Wade is judicial imperialism? Americans are starting to get pretty sick of these double standards and mealy-mouthed talking points. Pretty sick of politicians who just 4 years ago declared they couldn't possibly confirm a Democratic nominee to the Supreme Court in the early months of an election year, but are now rushing to confirm a Republican nominee in the middle of an election that's already underway. And most of all, pretty sick of Republicans claiming that they support protections for Americans with pre-existing conditions, while at the same time supporting a lawsuit that would eliminate them. Well, we're about to put a few of these Senate Republicans on the record. Soon, the Senate will vote on a bill that, if passed, would protect the health care of hundreds of millions of Americans and prevent efforts by the Department of Justice to advocate that courts strike down the Affordable Care Act. I was able to move this measure to the floor, despite the fact that Republicans didn't want it, and now we'll have a vote. Will Republican senators vote to stop President Trump's Justice Department from spending taxpayer dollars trying to eliminate the taxpayers' health care? We will see very shortly. If senators truly want to support protections for Americans with pre-existing conditions, they'd vote to damage President Trump's legal effort to eliminate them. It's simple as that. No amount of sophistry or explanation is needed. Yes or no? I ask unanimous consent. I'll be given a chance to finish my remarks in the next few minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. It's simple as that. Are they with the people who want protection or not? Or are they standing with President Trump, who wants to destroy it? It is that simple. Because if President Trump and Republican lawsuit is successful, every single American stands to lose vital health care protections or access to care. Millions of Americans would see drug costs skyrocket. Tens of millions of families would lose health care coverage during the worst health crisis in a century. More than 130 million Americans with pre-existing conditions would lose vital protections, including every American who contracted COVID. which would be treated as a pre-existing condition. Women would see their country hurtle backward at a time when they could be charged more than men for insurance, simply because they were women. This vote, which I was fortunate enough to obtain, will show America which party stands with protecting Americans' health care and protections for pre-existing conditions, and which party opposes it. It's plain and simple. Are you with Leader McConnell, who wants to rip away people's protections? Are you with President Trump, who wants to ruin our American health care by eliminating ACA? Are you with the American people who desperately need these protections? Are you with the mother or father whose son or daughter has cancer and the insurance company says, you're not getting any insurance, or you're going to require that company to give them the insurance that family so desperately needs? The eyes of America are on this body and on Republican senators right now. Whose side are you on? President Trump's or the American people who want health care? I yield the floor. Of a quorum.
All right, we were taking some of the speeches on the Senate floor. Senator Chuck Schumer just wrapping up there. Hi, everyone. Mike Page here as we continue to bring you events from across the country. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Right now, we're going to go out to a little bit earlier today in Las Vegas. It was a memorial for the 3rd anniversary of the mass shooting that happened back on October 1st, 2017. Hard to believe already that it's been 3 years since that devastating mass shooting that killed more than 50 people and injured more than 800 people in that shooting that happened at Mandalay Bay. That was shooting from across the area onto that concert where Jason Aldean was performing. So we're going to go out to this memorial. There's some sad moments there as family members talking about losing their loved ones during that tragedy. Let's listen.
Jeez. Man. Oh.
I'm going to text you something. JG.
Yeah, exactly. But still, it isn't like.
No wonder you see that.
Do you have to go sit down or something? I'm not. I'll do it on the phone. Yes.
You see the official one on too?
I'm not. Yeah, yes. The guy CPAC.
Yeah.
That was him. Don't mention my name.
Next year they're gonna.
No.
You're probably gonna let your
Because I can. No, because remember, was it Sam? It's a whole bunch of photograph. And to be honest, who was it?
So this was this year. I wasn't there this year. I was in South Carolina.
Right. I wasn't there this year either.
So.
I was somewhere.
Yeah, you guys are
something. I wasn't there.
Yeah, because the one that happened in either 2019 or 2018 was like that serial guy. Like, but he was the Russian flag guy over like at the 2017.
But Sacha Baron Cohen was the guy dressed as Trump.
Yeah.
With the girl actor. That was him. Yeah.
No one knew.
Yeah, no one knew. Yeah.
Watch what I texted you.
Come on. Oh, yeah. That's so funny.
You know how young kids like you hate this stuff.
Just, you have to watch it.
You know what I did see this earlier?
Oh my God.
Yeah, and you must have.
And then John Decker asked
Like,
if
I'm
Zipper
sure like they give them
with the ballot in Pennsylvania.
ID, they probably be like, no.
And Decker goes, I cover the news and I like to report accurately on the news. And when the president says they found a lot of ballots in the river, I simply want to know where the river is.
That's funny.
And true.
You know, where's the river? Let me know what you need. It's down. Like right here.
Yeah.
Down
Oh,
I really can't right now. We're just being real careful. Oh yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. No, for us. But that's what it's about. Right. Otherwise, my plan was to be gone from this one. Yeah, I mean, but it was sort of, yeah, this operation. That's not, no. Integrated. No, don't do that. There's a thread. Than the previous operation. And part of that, it's possible that part of it is just because do that? But I think it's mostly the opposite. But yes, no, you're really supposed to take a leave, so you couldn't be getting paid for 2 days at the time. I don't know really that. Exactly.
I like how they just. Yeah, like that's kind of.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're not talking about just one person.
Make sure.
Just to make sure, yeah.
I get it. I've seen it all.
I mean, I think whenever they're testing, they use something like those that they cover up.
Sure. You gonna be salty today or what?
That's dumb.
Give me some of that China stuff. If there's any chance for yeah, oh yeah, totally. Let them trip on themselves. Exactly. But no, they didn't take them.
Jason, is that live? Jason, is that live?
No, someone clipped it.
Oh. Is that it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
It's like, what kind of people are we only work together for a short period of time. We're very friendly.
Same thing, right?
No,
They're slightly different. The one that you have to pay attention to which way you put it in. As opposed to the newer one. Yeah, I think the one.
Yeah, I have a lot of seeds. Oh, she's a fun,
Yeah.
I think tighter loose.
but you know, not.
I mean,
Yeah.
would not be.
She probably dealt with a lot of stuff internal too.
Power bank?
Yeah, it probably dealt with a lot of.
Battery.
Yeah, they haven't even that much.
Or unless you have it.
I don't have a
Just
we weren't trying to have shoes. There was something going on.
That's just more car division side on the one side. I'm gonna call it.
Yeah, but I wasn't trained before.
No, that's my point.
There's a rule where you can't.
John?
Majority of the share two views at once.
Tell him,
Maybe do majority minority.
now and then come over.
I know that.
And he sold it.
Oh, no, that's not. Kevin's coming from.
I think even more like car division side.
To be honest with you, there's very little.
Lawrence is the.
Sometimes Kevin will get information.
Yeah,
Late
it's
in the
like the board.
because she refuses to call. She will not.
Really? He owns it.
She thinks it's pretty.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Not just.
Yeah.
She doesn't see the deals.
Really?
Oh, yes. Oh,
Because the other one were never that way.
Well, she didn't.
She didn't.
No. Like, I don't think she. But, you know, he didn't have to interview, right?
No.
So. He didn't care about it. And he did, like, every freaking day.
But it was like, but that's not.
You know,
You know, just kind of, yeah. I mean,
No, you're on there. But so I think it was really.
I wonder, I'm curious to know who would buy that.
For whatever policy purposes, it was your fault.
Exactly.
They grew up together, they're old school, they got along, they could talk to each other, they could work it out. They just cut through, like, it's different. If you start dating somebody, you gotta go through that rigmarole of the game. They just skipped the whole game. They didn't have to do that.
Yeah.
You know, so she just bypasses them all. She
Barrack held
from the Democrats.
exactly. Still holds the fastest match in race, not.
No, what happens when the new generation comes to us?
Race.
What's that number? And we'll figure out where.
Around,
how much.
Monster.
What the total is. We give them that, and then we go back.
And then,
But it's.
I looked it up on
The problem with the new generation, he just wants to. Oh, yeah,
and the devil's in the yellow.
Yeah, confidence to him is, we'll just give you half of whatever you want. And that's not,
Yeah.
right?
How to live right
Like, he doesn't understand the ideological
but no one
that
still
Republicans will have on a given program. Yeah.
Because Barrack held
Because that was probably like, that was the day.
And the
flat out all the time.
all he cared about infusion and cash from the economy.
Probably like,
You know they
That
would have
helps
made
to
it
work.
up time, all on the straight.
You know, he's not ideological.
I would imagine like they already left, so the orders, yeah, they just.
I was so wrong last time, I can't, you know, I don't know. I hope so. I really do. And I did
Imagine
send him
if
off.
racing in the cars just on six, not three.
He hasn't ever done that. He hates Trump.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
No, have you looked at his Twitter account last week? Nasty.
Okay. But you know, because they
Just,
weren't.
you know, he's really, he's up
So it was all.
I say nasty, I mean, he's like normal, but,
Yeah.
you know, he's very public about it, but he's not. I've never heard him say a word.
Interesting. I didn't
No,
know.
no, he's just like, the problem, he said, he's like, the problem with the debate wasn't the moderator, the questions of the format. It was
But
the
I think
candidate.
that is.
He said he never failed to not be right or something like that.
Interesting. Faster on the story.
Yeah, no, he does, he's not angling for anything now, he's just,
Yeah, right.
saying it like he sees it.
And so they got that, wing suspension for,
We're far behind, sorry.
It's all good. That's when that was good.
Oh, do you want to figure out your audio issue? Yes, he fixed it in the last 10 minutes of the press.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it wasn't, it just.
But that was the issue. It wasn't like you found a stopgap.
No, no, he fixed the issue. It was, you know, as you know, we've got several devices, and so sort of there's a lot of failure points. The issue was what we thought for the longest time was with our streaming software, and actually it wasn't. It was with setting Zoom on where to bring the audio in from. It was a really simple change, but it was sort of counterintuitive. Yeah, you get
Is it the race class?
and we now have it documented on, so it won't repeat itself next time. It's part of it.
Yeah, because it's like.
yeah, because, even after, often even after the race, they were very.
Mhm.
And they obviously super down, so.
Get rid of the other.
Yes, initially, good years.
You thought you always thought it was going to be
Oh, yeah. That's right. That's why they're doing that, right? Yeah, yeah. Because they had people like.
I know. I figured it. So
Yeah.
my point is, we
It's like
moved
a
this.
fall, like,
Oh,
You,
nah.
did you have a feeling it was going to go on?
Nah.
Did your wife?
Nah.
And she didn't. Yeah,
She probably did.
she
but
really
not
wanted
me.
to get her.
No.
Oh.
No. She actually thought it. Yeah. Because I come from London. For like 4 years. My niece was the first girl. Yeah, the rubber
Wow.
ones got that.
That's wild.
So, yeah, then for me it didn't matter.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. I mean, it was like glad I had four.
Mhm.
It's not. I'm glad I had one. Yeah. Regardless of how the order came. Because I definitely wanted to do things a little different than my absent dad.
Yeah, that's good, man. That's good. That's like a.
But it's like
and
polar
use it as
opposites.
fuel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you guys, you in the ring again or what?
One day.
I
I'm
guess.
just thinking about it.
See, I just didn't want to far apart.
Mhm.
Because we waited, I mean.
You mentioned like someone from good year.
And, but did I think 19 months? No. But I I'm thankful for it now because based on their birthdays, no one should one create. Oh. In fact, we're gonna hold him until he's almost 6 to start.
Okay. What month is he born?
October.
Okay, that's not big.
October 21st.
Cool.
What is, November?
No, she's April, so she's 2.5.
Oh, April.
2.5 this month. 2.5, 2 days ago. She actually had, big deal, you'll appreciate this because we talked a little bit about this. Yesterday was our first entire day of dry dock.
Awesome.
Yeah.
You know what we did? Once that progress started,
And you just did that way?
nope, never did. But I think that, and I think we'll do it with her. I think that he understood the sensation was different.
Oh, okay, okay.
And so it made there was a cognitive thing there.
Wild.
Versus just sort of, and again, that might be overstating it, but literally because it moved.
Yeah.
And then he
Well,
and you get him dry. Again, he's like, oh, it's already there, why not?
Sure.
You know, I'm already awake.
I've heard boys are harder to train.
I don't know, man. He's been pretty easy.
That's awesome.
Because he still thinks he can't get up.
Yeah.
We put him in a big bowl.
Yeah, that's clutch.
Yeah, so yeah, so we don't ever, you know, he thinks that like I can't get up until I smoke. Like so we're
That's
still
awesome.
kind of there. So it's like
Ride that train.
Yeah. So he trains that he can get up to the bathroom or not run around in the middle of the night.
Be able to, get your coffee going in the morning.
Right. Exactly.
Buy yourself 20 minutes.
Yeah. What's most important? But it's good, but yeah, boy and girls is totally different.
Really?
Yeah. What she's attuned to, he's not, and what he is, she's not. So she's probably more attuned to him than he is to her.
Sure. That's probably typical for a second one.
I mean, she loves, you know, she plays with cars and everything he wants, she wants.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were good with that. But she's a fighter, like, she'll push him back. Yeah, it's like, okay, this is good. You know, the other things you want to do. They'll get to a point where like, okay,
They're on their way. 2 minutes.
Oh, Brian texted me the other day on Thursday and Friday, and I thought about you because he
Did I tell you I'm talking with the house historian about it?
No.
Yeah, I'm not giving it up. It's a load.
What, have you come to any terms yet? Or?
I think he misunderstood my question, to be honest with you, so I gotta go back to him. I'm glad you said that. Well, yeah, but he and I go way back.
Oh, okay. Fair.
Good afternoon. Sorry for keeping you waiting a little longer. Hope you're all well. Yesterday, we received welcome news that there was an arrest made in the shooting earlier this month of the two LA County sheriffs. It was so disgusting, just a targeted attack. I know that sheriffs have a long road to recovery ahead of them, but I hope this brings a sense of peace to them and to their families. Our police officers take on immense risk every single day, and they should know that the majority of the country is praying for them and for their safety. Today marks the 71st anniversary of the People's Republic of China. Over the decades, we have seen a communist regime who have been ruthless in their attempt to seize power. Today's Chinese Communist Party is no closer to allowing their citizens to have freedom than they were 31 years ago in Tiananmen Square. We have seen them break international agreements, carry out human rights abuses, and violate the sovereignty of neighboring nations. Previous administrations have implemented a strategy of accommodation. Let's just look at what has happened. Former President Obama in 2011, let me quote him, "I absolutely believe that China's peaceful rise is good for the world and it's good for America." Vice President Joe Biden, just a few years ago in 2015, stated, "We want to see China rise." Has Joe Biden, who is the Democratic Party, changed his view? Well, just last year, as he was running for president, Joe Biden said, "China is not competition for us." It's an interesting quote that he would make. Perhaps Democrats are comfortable with bending to a knee for China, but Republicans will not gamble with our economy or our national security. That is why House Republicans stood up a China task force back in May. The China task force was actually supposed to be bipartisan. I went to Speaker Pelosi more than a year ago. Talked to the Democratic leadership for more than 8 months. Finally got them to agree. We even had to negotiate on the numbers, same number of Republicans as Democrats. Because this transcends party. The challenge of what China gives not only to the world but to America. Pre-COVID. And we got to the date where we were going to announce it in a joint press conference. Even the Washington Post reporter had already written up a story. Only for the Democrats to back away. Over the past few months, the members of the task force worked to draft a comprehensive blueprint to counter China's threat, and yesterday they delivered. They continue to follow through on our commitment to America we laid out earlier this month to rebuild the greatest economy we have ever seen, and to end our dependency on China and implement pro-growth policies. Much like Democrats have neglected to protect America from geopolitical threats, they are also neglecting their livelihoods at home. For the past several months, there has been one common denominator stopping us from getting another COVID relief bill. It's the Speaker of the House. But let's listen to what she has done. We know from past behavior, every time the 4 leaders got together to do a COVID relief bill, we came to an agreement after Speaker Pelosi had delayed it, sometimes a week at a time. When the much-needed money for small businesses, for their employees to stay open or to keep paying them, it was so popular that we're going to run out of money that the Speaker was warned about it weeks in advance. She proudly stood at late-night television in front of her refrigerator eating ice cream, almost laughing at the American public by saying she said no. She told us she would keep us in, not let us leave in August, because she has the power to do that, the only one. But she let us all go. Instead of utilizing that pressure to make people come to a common agreement. But she did call us back. I was kind of excited when I heard she was going to. But was it for COVID relief? Was it to deal with those who are unemployed or the small businesses who were going to shut their doors and lay more people off? Or maybe it was for the schools that needed the resources to open back up. No. It was purely political once again. It was about a post office that already had money. A post office that we know does not have the challenge with delivering the mail. It's the states that do not have the ability to handle within the election office all the mail ballots. So she said once again, she would not let us leave. I wonder if we could trust her at her word this time. It's interesting, she decided only once Republicans have put on the floor a discharge petition, which the American public, so they can understand, it's one of those archaic rules within the House. It's the only power the minority has to get a bill to the floor to go around the speakers to get 218 people to sign. You would think it'd be quite easy to get 218 members to sign a discharge petition to help small businesses. They've already voted for it once before. Why deny it to go forward? Some within her own party has criticized her. So you know what we did yesterday on a vote? We actually put it to the floor, and every single Democrat voted against it. So it seems Nancy Pelosi has as much power on her members as the Chinese Communist Party has on their whole party. When I look at what her compromise bill is all about? Well, it once again mentions cannabis more than it mentions jobs, which I don't think those in COVID relief believe that's the priority they should do. Provides a massive tax break to the wealthy, and you know who would get the biggest tax break of all? Michael Bloomberg. I guess that's okay in the Democratic Party because he's supplied the most money for him. $100 million, I guess, in Florida. He talked in his own debate that he bought Congress's majority with more than $100 million. He sent him $60 million now, so I guess they feel obligated to give him the biggest tax break of almost any American. You know the one thing it does cut back on money? To make our streets safe and secure. $600 million they cut from their original bill for law enforcement. If Joe Biden is the Democratic Party and they're cutting $600 million, I guess he does support cutting the police and defunding them. Nancy Pelosi has said numerous times that she would keep us here to get it done. That was in July. She made us wait all summer, but who did she really make wait? The small businesses that have now declared bankruptcy, or those people that are employed by them that are now out of work, or those at their unemployment that do not get the extra benefit. Or what about the airlines? Could she not see past politics for once? Could she not close the refrigerator and listen to the American public? Could she not think that she's above the law, that only she can go to get her hair done while others are denied? The arrogance is appalling, and it must stop. With everything that was happening, from the presidential debate to the lack of action in the House, I'm afraid too many people missed some critical information. I want to commend Director Radcliffe on bringing transparency to the intelligence. If you read his letter, everybody in America should read this letter. Every single member in Congress should not only read this letter in the House or Senate, but we need the underlying information behind it that we've been asking for more than 4 years. That the nightmare that America was put through, if what is stated in here is correct, is unbelievable. That's why facts need to be known. It's not about politics. It's about the democracy of our nation. This is probably the biggest news that has happened. And I commend Director Radcliffe for bringing transparency out, but more importantly, I ask that the members in the House and Senate can get the underlying information behind this so we can get once and for all the truth. With that, let me open it up for questions. Yes, ma'am.
So, Secretary Mnuchin came back to Pelosi with the $1.6 trillion offer yesterday. Some of your own members, including Kevin Brady, have brought up concerns about those spending levels and some of the provisions in that. I was wondering if you shared any of those concerns, and if they are able to come to a deal on something along those lines, whether you think it's something that...
It shows how far the administration Republicans are going, where Pelosi continues to put the roadblock even higher for the option of not having something. You've been here this entire year. You've watched the four leaders, when they all come together, we come to an agreement. This is the only time that the Speaker has tried to take all the power, and it's the only time nothing is getting done. Her own members of her own party are writing letters to her concerned. The only reason why she has any movement is because Republicans put up a discharge petition. It's interesting why she let us go last Friday at the last minute when the discharge petition became ripe, so you'd only have 15 minutes to sign it on Friday. It's interesting why they keep Democratic staff down by the book to sign, to look exactly who's signing and what intimidation they're making to keep Democrats holding back. It'd be interesting to know for the American public, why would anybody in Congress not sign? It's not asking for more money, it's allowing the money that is there for PPP to go to those employees who need it. They're hurting. But do they think winning is so important to try to hurt the economy further? Because that's the decision she's making. It's a calculated decision. It's a harmful decision. It is the wrong decision.
If a deal is reached, it's going to be at least 1.6 trillion, and your members are concerned about that price tag. Senate Republicans are concerned about going higher than 1 trillion. If a deal is reached today or potentially this week, can you guarantee that your members are going to support that?
No, you can't ever say what people on the Democrat side or Republican side until you see what's in it. Is there liability protection? Are the schools going to be protected from being sued, or the small businesses? Because the Democrats never proposed that. Is this just more money into cannabis and not to jobs? I mean, what is the priority of the underlying? There are so many problems within the Democratic bills, why it's gone nowhere, and why Pelosi continues to hold on for a false hope that nobody will support. She had 14 of her own party vote against it. I bet there'd be further now. So the real question is, what is inside the ability to do it? There is lots of money still sitting out there that's already appropriated, almost $1 trillion or more, that we can get to the American public, to the states, to the schools, to the unemployed. But it's only been held up because of Nancy Pelosi. Yes?
Question, just to clarify, do you support the $1.6 trillion offer that
I
Manchin made?
haven't seen it all yet.
Okay.
So.
I want to ask about the debate. And specifically, would you have any advice for the president going forward in the next debate? Is there anything you think he should do differently? Do you think the attacks on Joe Biden's sons, for example, was a bridge too far? I mean, what is your advice to the president there about how he should tackle this next debate?
First, if you ask me about the debate, President Trump won the debate. Could it be more productive? Actually, my best advice is let Joe Biden talk. He is the Democratic Party. His ideas are far long gone. I think the more he talks, the more the American public would decide they don't want Joe Biden. Is there a reason why he puts a lid on almost most of his days? Is there a reason why he is hidden and not communicated? Is there a reason why he won't tell the American public who he'd point to the Supreme Court justice? Candidate Trump did that before the last election, so the public knew ahead of time.
Speak more and letting the
I don't
public...
know if it's a mistake or not, but I'd let him speak all he wants. Every time Joe Biden, and maybe that's why the campaign puts a lid on it about what'd they do in the 2 weeks prior? Half of all the days would put a lid on by 10 a.m. Joe Biden usually gets in trouble not by somebody asking a question, but just by he's talking. So the more he talks, I think the stronger President Trump's campaign is. Then just run on the facts. Run on the record. You know, Joe Biden has a long record, 47 years inside the Senate. Put that in perspective. When Joe Biden went to the Senate, there were people in the Senate who were born in the 1800s. Think of all the things Joe Biden won't tell you. Why won't he? Why won't he name one law enforcement officer who would endorse him? Why wouldn't he tell the American public more about his son when he was vice president? Why did you bring your son on a government airplane to China? Why did your son do business with China? What were you warned by those in the administration about what your son was doing? Now, with new information coming forward, that a person very close to Putin, a wife, provided more than $3.5 million to your son, instead of just saying no, wouldn't you want the information? Wouldn't you want to come forward? Doesn't the public have a right to know? But more importantly, what are your policies? Because you say one thing during the primary, now you're saying something different. I've never seen anybody flip-flop more. I watched him look a woman in the eye. Said, read my lips to the
For the
point, what he
PPP
would
loan.
say. That he was going to end fossil fuel. Then he wants to try to say he's for fracking after he said he was opposed to it. He says he's for a Green New Deal, but when it's the debate, no, it's not a Green New Deal. But it still does the same effect to the economy of harming it. He says he's going to raise taxes on the very first day. He also said some very damaging things as well. He also said he thinks poor people are just as smart as white people. Or white kids, I think, to be exact. That's offensive. He also stood as vice president, went to a former KKK's funeral, speaking very highly of him, along with Speaker Pelosi. So yes, I would let Joe Biden talk more. And if I was President Trump, Just say what you have done. The strongest economy in the history of the nation. You compare it directly across from the failures of the Joe Biden-Obama administration. You reformed the VA, where hundreds of thousands were harmed and died because of the lack of ability even to get an appointment. You rebuilt the military. There is record after record which President Trump has to run on, and I think it's the strongest ability to win a re-election. Yes.
What are the chances you think the House of Representatives could decide an election? Speaker Pelosi put out a note saying that it was important for her to win state races because right now Republicans control more chambers of Congress in these states or chambers in the states and stuff. So do you think that it could get to the House of Representatives to decide, and should there be an added emphasis on winning these state houses and the state elections?
I'm not quite sure why you want to win the state houses. Maybe I don't understand it correctly. It's one per state.
One vote per state.
It's the members of Congress who vote, does it not?
She was explaining earlier this morning that it could go at one point to where each state gets one vote. So California, the 53, could get one.
But that's not a state house. A state house
Legislative body is in Sacramento. The 53 members who represent California is a federal office in Congress. So I understand she's talking about a state house, but that's a whole different subject. The way the rules read in the Constitution, it comes to the House only if it's a tie, which is really hard to do, but maybe it's possible. It's probably more possible back in 1980 because there was a third-party candidate. I don't see a third-party candidate, so I was voting for one or the other. So probably pretty difficult to get a tie. But if it comes to the House, each state gets one vote. So the makeup, so you have some states that only have one representative, Alaska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana. And then if you look at the number of parties, by the number of states, Republicans have more states than Democrats, even though we're in the minority. But it takes 26 ever to get the nominee to become president, and the Senate picks the vice president. There's also a factor in there, if it can't get to that point, the speaker could become president, but they'd have to resign that position as well. And I know she has such hatred for this president that she tries to find every avenue, but I'm not quite sure she understands the ramification of how it works. But I think it's not very likely that it does come to the House.
Can I go back to the letter that you had mentioned from Director Ratcliffe, the timing right before the first debate? The Senate Republican-led Intelligence Committee dismissed that early on. They didn't dismiss it. The reporting from sources on the committee said that it was.
They didn't have this information. What I would like you to go to any member,
The Intel Committee, the House and the Senate. I happen to be a member of Gang of Eight. I never knew any of this. This is why this is so important. Don't bring into timing. If you want to bring into timing, read in this letter when this stuff was transpiring. Let's look here. July 26, 2016. September 2016. Very interesting things being said here on that timing. People have been requesting this information and underlying information for the last 4 years because they've been investigating this. The real question would lie is, who's been holding this information up from the members of Congress and the Senate? Why did we put the American public through so much? Why is it just now we're getting this information? Ratcliffe should be commended for bringing out transparency. That's exactly what he said he would do in the job, and that's what he's doing. The question for anybody in the Senate or the House should be, I want to see the underlying info. And why were we denied that info all this time? I asked Devin Nunes, who was the chair of the Intel, had he seen this information? Just go ask him. Yeah. It's his birthday today, too, so we should wish him happy birthday if you talk to him.
What do you think, on a scale of 1 to 10, the chances are of a bipartisan deal coming together on coronavirus aid at this point? What's your
is Nancy Pelosi still involved?
She is still involved.
I'd give you a low number.
If you put the 4 leaders in the room, or if you put a few other people from the Democratic Party, we'd get one today.
What about Meadows? Do you think he increases or decreases those chances?
I think Meadows could get it. Meadows was a part of the other ones as well.
He was?
There's one
Which ones?
common denominator that has failed every time and has had it delayed. Yeah, when we did one of the bills, he was already chief. He helped in it. Speaker Pelosi, you've been here, you've reported it. Do you remember that Sunday that we all came back, the four leaders?
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember what Schumer said just the day before? Like the deal was done? And we sat in the room and Nancy blew it up for a week, really not changing the deal, but giving more money for the arts. Then you remembered after we got the PPP, her stopping more money for it. It wasn't asking for any new legislation, was just put more money in because it's so successful. Saved more than 50 million jobs. The question has to go to the speaker now. Are you doing this for political reasons? Do you want America to hurt so bad to try to get some advantage in an election?
For a potential President Biden? Do you think that's the strategy for them?
What benefit would that be? What benefit? How many more people would be unemployed? The president from the very beginning has been supportive of getting an agreement. It's only been one person holding it up. So it's easy to realize everything about her is politics. She ought to maybe not get her hair done all by herself, but listen to the people who've been unemployed. Listen to the people who own that shop who've been closed for so long, who need the PPP. Listen to the people who need the unemployment. And if she wants to put a red line, then go ask Steny Hoyer why he said that's not a red line. The Republicans are actually right about that all states are not equal. So any point that she makes is really just a political point to stop something, instead of finding a reason to put people before politics. That's all we're asking. So if Speaker Pelosi is not involved, we'd get it done. Her own people know that as well. You all have a nice weekend.
Thanks. Have a good one.
Right. Your people know. Yeah, we've been good nighted.
Good.
We were good nighted in the middle.
Yeah, because I emailed them. I emailed them right in the middle and then she came back. I appreciate it. Oh.
Radcliffe thing, that was already been dismissed by
No, that one. I guess everything's probably should have clarified that first.
What, this thing?
Yeah. Wait, that one?
Yeah, that one.
It's basically.
You guys can so far.
Read it.
Media goes haywire about interrupting in debates and then chooses to pursue that very same tactic themselves. This is a White House briefing. You ask a question and you give me time to answer. Yes.
Haley, the president said at the debate that Roe versus Wade was not on the ballot and that Judge Amy Coney Barrett's view was not known. She signed a newspaper ad in 2006 which called for, quote, an end to the barbaric legacy of Roe versus Wade. And the president has explicitly promised to support judges that overturn Roe. Was he downplaying her views on Tuesday night? And what do you say to the American public about whether Roe is on the ballot?
The president has been clear that he would never ask a judge to prejudge a case. Judge Amy Coney Barrett has, on multiple occasions, said it is never appropriate for a judge to impose that judge's personal convictions, whether they derive from faith or anywhere else on the law. She said that she continues to stand and vehemently believe the core proposition that if there is ever a conflict between a judge's personal conviction and that judge's duty under the rule of law, it is never, ever permissible for that judge to follow their personal convictions in the decision of a case rather than what the law requires.
The president expects her to overturn Roe. He has said he would only appoint judges
The
that overturn Roe.
president would never ask a judge to prejudge a case. And what I would also say is we fully expect that the Ginsburg rule be followed throughout the course of these proceedings. It was then Senator Joe Biden who set the Ginsburg rule in saying that there are no questions on how Ginsburg will decide any specific cases that may come before her. And Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg indeed applied that rule throughout the course of her hearing on the First Amendment religion
Say
clause.
that her
and various
views are
other
not known.
issues.
They are very clear.
Will the president commit to participating in the next debate before the commission changes the rules?
First, with regard to the commission rule changes, the president made clear his view on that yesterday, that he thinks the only way there's a fair debate is change in the moderator and a change in the Democrat nominee. He wants to debate. He plans on being at the debate, but he wants the rules to be fair and wants a fair exchange and doesn't want rules that cover for a certain candidate's inability to perform well.
Yes. Thank you, Haley. Can you explain why it's appropriate for the president to be holding rallies this weekend in two areas that this White House has declared to be red zones in Wisconsin?
Yeah, so the president believes that people have a First Amendment right to political speech. He is having a rally. People can choose whether or not to come.
But the governor has begged the White House to please not continue having events like this. Your own coronavirus task force says this is an area that people need to be really careful and double down on social distancing. So why is it right for the president to be coming in there and holding another rally or two rallies?
We employ measures to protect rally goers. We encourage
We've all
mask
covered these
wearing
rallies.
and
These people are
sanitizing.
shoved together. There are thousands of people standing close to each
Did
other,
you watch
not
the
wearing
Democrat
masks.
nominees rally yesterday? There was no social distancing there, so I assume you guys expressed the same line of questioning to the Democrats. But what I would say is this, is there really seems to be two standards of health in this country, one for Trump supporters and one for everyone else. You had 1,300 health experts literally sign a letter that said, we do not condemn these gatherings, speaking of the protests that we all saw play out. We do not condemn these gatherings as risky for COVID-19 transmission. We support them as vital to the national public health. So it's vital if you're protesting, but somehow political speech is no longer vital when it comes to a Trump supporter. Caitlin.
So the Proud Boys, or people who consider them to be members of this group, give voice to these misogynistic, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant views. They're a despicable group by pretty much anyone's standards. So when the president was asked about them, and you say he denounced them, that's what you're insisting that he did on the debate stage the other night. If that's the case, then why are they celebrating what the president said on the debate stage in front of millions of people?
Well, I don't speak for that group, so I'm not sure why you're asking me why they're saying a certain
If
thing.
someone denounced you, you probably wouldn't put it on a T-shirt and make badges of it, right?
The president did denounce them. He was asked, will you tell them to stand down? He said, sure, and went on to stand.
By, which seems like an instruction.
He said, stand back. And then just yesterday when he was asked, he said specifically, stand down, a synonym with stand back. And the president said, sure, when asked by the moderator whether they should stand down. So
No, he
again,
said-
it's really interesting, too, to see that the media seems to be the only one putting the names of these groups into headlines, into media reporting. He didn't know who the Proud Boys were. The first time I heard of them was in the debate, but the media continues to put these names into circulation and give them a lot of public attention.
He was given about 12 hours, more than that, since from the debate when he was asked to clarify yesterday. And he didn't come out and clarify yesterday. Instead, he did what you did when John asked you to unambiguously denounce these groups. You just pointed to past things that you've said. You can't, I just don't understand why you knew you were going to get these questions and you don't have a statement ready to just say, we do unambiguously denounce these groups.
Caitlin, you know what is... Do you know why people have lost trust in the media? There was a reporter from your network yesterday, and in a tweet said, quote, the president...
I'm asking you a question. I don't even know what you're going to bring up, but that has nothing to do with what I'm asking you
I
right now.
sat here when you lobbed your partisan attack question, so you will allow me to give an answer. The president and someone from your network said yesterday in a tweet, the president dodged a question about white supremacy. That was a tweet from a CNN reporter. The president specifically, verbatim, was asked yesterday, white supremacy, do you denounce them? To which he responded, I have always denounced any form of that. Those are the facts. And CNN, I know that truth is of no moment to your network, but those are the facts.
They're not the facts. Why are Republicans are calling on the president to be more forceful? His own party.
Thanks, Kelly. I have a question about unemployment, but I first wanted to clean up something from your opening. You said Judge Barrett was a Rhodes Scholar. I'm not sure that that's true.
That's what I have written
She
here.
attended
Rhodes College. Attended Rhodes College, so my bad.
Very different thing.
Yes.
All right. Anyway, within the last week, around 50,000 workers, Disney, United, American Airlines have all lost their jobs. There's negotiations going up on Capitol Hill, but there seems to be a division between Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, who has expressed some willingness and ability to work with Speaker Pelosi, and Chief of Staff Meadows, who is widely reported to be against sort of moving forward with this deal, was up on the Hill speaking with Senator McConnell yesterday, but not involved in the actual talks. At this point, isn't it time for the president, especially considering the tight calendar before the election, to step in himself and have these conversations? And, this came up at the debate the other night. If not now, when for the president to get involved?
Yeah, so, first I would say Nancy Pelosi is not being serious. If she becomes serious, then we can have a discussion here. But
Lower her offer by trillions of dollars.
we raised our offer, but when you lower your offer $2.2 trillion and you ask for direct payments to illegal immigrants and you ask for certain deportation forgivenesses in your offer, it's not a serious offer. What we are talking about here is relief for the American people, for American citizens, not direct payments to illegal immigrants. We raised our offer to $1.6 trillion. Among that was $250 billion for state and local. The $250 billion for state and local is the estimated loss because of COVID. And also there's $150 billion for schools, $50 billion above what Nancy Pelosi asked for. It is a good proposal, but it's one that she is not interested in. And you have one more question?
I was just going to follow up on whenever you.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
If immigration is a stumbling block and this deal's not going to get done because of that, Chief Meadows in the past had said that you guys were looking at unilateral executive actions on airline aid. Specifically, we're seeing massive layoffs in that sector right now. He'd also said that there might be other things available for the millions of other Americans who are facing joblessness right now. But are any of those things going to happen?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's very sad to see what's happening in the airline industry. I met a few of the airline workers on a flight who would lose their job, and their job loss, 19,000 people facing layoffs, is because of Nancy Pelosi. The White House right now, you talk about unilateral action. We are willing to look at a plan, legislation that is just clean legislation to protect those airline workers. Nancy Pelosi, rather than playing election partisan politics, should come to the negotiating table. Let's consolidate around things we agree on. And I think something we can agree on is 19,000 workers should not lose their job in the airlines. So it's incumbent upon Nancy Pelosi to engage with Secretary Mnuchin and the Chief of Staff on making that a reality. Yes.
Thank you, Kelly. As you know, the president has criticized the mail-in voting process quite a bit over the last few weeks. The other day, he said they found a lot of ballots in a river. Who is they?
So what the president was referring to are something that we've seen just in the last 7 days, where in Wisconsin there were trails of May ending up in a ditch. That's, I believe, the specific he was referring to, and that included absentee ballots.
We're specifically, in this particular statement, though, who is they that found those ballots, and where is this river anywhere in this country?
The local authorities. It was a ditch in Wisconsin that they were found, and I can get the article to your inbox if you'd like. And beyond that,
if he misspoke, that's fine.
No,
so
that's
he meant
that's what the president was referring to. And you're missing the forest for the trees here. The point is.
No, I cover the news, and I like to report accurately in the news. And when the president says they found a lot of ballots in a river, I simply want to know where the river is.
No, you simply want to ignore the fact of the matter. Again,
I got asked so many questions about this in my Fox affiliates. Where is this river? And I can't give them an accurate information. And that's why I'm asking you.
This is what is happening here. You are ignoring the problem here, which is last week in Pennsylvania, you had ballots found in a ditch. That is a fact. In Wisconsin, 7 military ballots, all marked for Trump, were found cast aside. There are problems with mass mail-in voting. I actually don't understand the lack of journalistic curiosity and reporting on this. There used to be curiosity. In fact, the Washington Post, before President Trump highlighted the problems with mail-in voting, they said the result was an unexpected stress test of mail balloting systems when this was tried, many of which were designed to handle only a small portion of the vote and are not ready to scale up in response to the pandemic. So the media once said mail-in voting is not ready to scale up in the middle of a pandemic. Now there's no journalistic curiosity when we're finding Trump ballots cast aside. There's no journalistic curiosity when 100,000
I'm asking you where the river is, and you can't give an
were sent out in Brooklyn.
If you say the
They were
president meant a
inaccurate
ditch,
ballots, and then
then say you meant a
100,000
ditch.
more.
I just want to know where the river
Filibustering
is.
and lack of journalistic curiosity.
I'm very curious. Where's the river?
Yes.
That's curiosity.
Kaylee, Senator Tim Scott said the president misspoke at the debate on white supremacy. Did he misspeak? And has he spoken to
When
Senator
the president
Scott?
denounced white supremacy and said, sure, no, he did not misspeak.
Has he spoken to Senator Scott?
Yes.
Has he spoken to Senator Scott?
Yes.
Kaylee, the 1.6 trillion that the administration has floated to Speaker Pelosi, is that the highest top line that the administration is going to go? And Speaker Pelosi also just said that she's expecting a counteroffer from the administration. Is the White House and Secretary Mnuchin preparing one right now?
Yeah, right now we have the 1.6 trillion number, and I'll let you know if that number goes up.
Thanks, Kaylee. How does the White House interpret the Pope's refusal to meet with Secretary of State Pompeo?
I have not spoken to the president about that, so I'd have to get back to you on that. Yes.
Kelly, I wanted to ask you about the statement from the President, Vladimir Putin, and Emmanuel Macron about the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. How worried is this White House that this conflict is going to escalate beyond a regional dispute?
Yeah, sorry, back up one second. What was the top of your question there? It was about what we just signed?
Yeah, there's a statement, I understand, that was put out by Vladimir Putin, Emmanuel Macron, and also Donald Trump that calls for peaceful negotiations.
On Armenia, Azerbaijan, right. Yeah, so President Trump, along with President Putin, as you noted, and President Macron, representing the co-chair countries of the OSCE Minsk group, released a statement condemning in the strongest terms the recent escalation of the violence along the line of contact in the conflict zone, and we call for an immediate cessation of hostilities between the relevant military forces. And we also call on the leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan to commit without delay to resuming substantive negotiations in good faith and without preconditions under the auspices of the OSCE Minsk group co-chairs.
Is there, though, just quickly follow up, is there concern about sort of regional powers, major regional powers being drawn into this? Is that something that the White House is sort of actively trying to combat?
That's all I have to say on that matter at this time. Yes.
For you. One about the list of former Trump administration officials who are coming out against President Trump and supporting Joe Biden is growing. Is the president concerned about these dissidents and what they are talking about?
No, we're not concerned. The people who have come out are people who don't have personal interactions with the president, and they're peddling things that are falsehoods to advance their careers.
And I have a question about the Latin vote. What is President Trump's strategy to convince the Latino voters beyond the Cubans and Catholics to vote for him? What is the importance of the Latino vote for him?
Yeah, the president believes that he has a lot of accomplishments for the Latino community, in particular historic low unemployment, a thriving economy, historic high home ownership for Latino men and women in this country. Those are things that President Trump made possible and will bring back in this economic recovery that we're seeing, this V-shaped recovery. And I'm glad you asked that point specifically, because there was some new data that came out that said as we're recovering in this super V-shaped recovery, we've regained nearly, for the Hispanic community, nearly 6 in 10 jobs lost among Hispanic Americans were regained, and it took Obama-Biden an entire year to recover that many jobs. So the V-shaped recovery is indeed a V-shaped recovery for Hispanic men and women in this country, especially.
What about his message against immigration? Do you think this could hurt
For what? On
Message on immigration.
The president believes that the Latino population very much wants a lawful immigration system, and also we believe his law and order message is resonating and very important as voters want to be secure in their homes and secure in their streets. Yes.
Thank you, Kaylee. The president recently unveiled his Platinum Plan, which is geared toward the Black community. Promises to create 3 million new jobs, $500 billion in access to capital. It's a lot of money, and nobody really seems to be talking about that. Can you tell us how this assistance will be administered and how the White House will follow up to track the success of the plan?
Yeah, this is a very important plan for the Black community. It's also, it bears mentioning that in the pandemic, as we've regained jobs, roughly 4 in 10 jobs lost among Black Americans have been gained, and it took Obama-Biden 2 years to do that. So we're indeed outpacing in job growth for the Black community and the Latino community. And the president has promised this community that he's looking to create 3 million jobs in the next term. He wants to create 500,000 new Black-owned businesses, increase access to capital in Black communities, almost $500 billion. He's done that with opportunity zones, and it's estimated that about 1 million people will be lifted out of poverty and given opportunity because of this, among another number of items, I should say, in the plan, where he wants to prosecute the KKK as domestic terrorists and make lynching a federal crime. Again, all of that lost upon the media as they misreport, take out of context, ignore the verbatim words of this president when he denounced white supremacy yesterday, when he denounced it at the debate, when he's denounced it more than any other president in modern history. And in fact, something else lost upon the media is the absolute turning of a blind eye to Antifa. Carrying the water for Democrats, the media, it apparently agrees with Jerry Nadler that Antifa violence is a myth. In August Senate hearings, Democrats refused to condemn Antifa. Again, no journalistic curiosity here, despite the fact that Andy Nadeau, who was a victim of Antifa, said Democrats, he should add the media too, have mastered the art of making its violence appear innocuous. Their violence isn't innocuous. Antifa is not an idea. Andy Nadeau can tell you that because he was beaten by a group of protesters, Antifa protesters, suffering brain bleed. Another man can tell you this, who in 2019, the victim, his name was Adam Kelly, suffered from a concussion and got 25 staples in his head, but still silence from Democrats, ignoring this group from Democrats. And in fact, as we just saw recently, there was a Trump supporter who was killed by a 100% Antifa man. That is how he described himself. And again, no reporting here, but I guess I did the job of the media by getting this information myself. This man who was 100% Antifa, this man, in fact, had been arrested before at 2 a.m. on July 5th in a public protest carrying an illegal weapon. He resisted arrest. He was taken to jail where he was merely given a citation, put back on the streets, and the very next month, this 100% Antifa man was lying in wait before he killed an innocent Trump supporter. Ideas do not target police officers. Ideas do not burn down buildings. Ideas do not kill innocent Americans. Organizations do. And Democrats should condemn the shameful group in the same manner President Trump continues to condemn white supremacy.
He's not condemning white supremacy. He's not condemning white supremacy.
Years ago today, 58
drives. In the very early stages of Sherman Act interpretation, the Supreme Court, taking a common law approach as Congress intended, very quickly determined that cartel activity was to be condemned per se. But then in 1898, in the Addison Pipe and Steel case, it confirmed that a restraint could be reasonable if it had a sensible relationship to a transaction with a lawful purpose. And except for the 1911 imposition of the per se rule against retail price fixing, A long period of time happened in which the courts were trying to feel their way through the complex issues that naturally arise when the antitrust laws are applied to particular industries, and there are nice judgments that are required to be made to determine what is anti-competitive and what is pro-competitive. Then in the late New Deal, in the second FDR term, under the leadership of Assistant Attorney General Jackson and his successor, Thurman Arnold, something changed in antitrust enforcement. With the encouragement of the antitrust agencies, the courts became far more willing to deprive companies of any right to defend their conduct, either using economic arguments or trying to show on the basis of facts and circumstances that what they were doing was justifiable, pro-competitive, that they lacked market power, or to present any other defense. This was the start of the so-called per se rule era, which occurred around 1945 with the Associated Press decision. A number of patent licensing practices were condemned per se, and on until when you reach United States versus Topco, almost any type of conduct challenged by a plaintiff or by the government was condemned per se, or a very strong presumption against business conduct. The legality of business conduct was adopted by the courts. But simultaneously with the end of that era, America's economic fortunes started to go south. We had severe competition from companies arising in Europe and Asia, and many of our leading industries began to see negative results, and our economy entered a period of stagflation. Scholars and academics in law and economics pointed this out in the 60s and 70s, and they weren't all from Chicago. As a matter of fact, you could say that the study of economics and its application to antitrust law was probably most notably introduced to antitrust enforcement by Lyndon Johnson's first Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust, Don Turner, who had both a Harvard PhD in economics and a Yale law degree, and who advocated very strongly that economic analysis be used as the touchstone for antitrust. And fortunately, in the mid-70s, the Supreme Court began to take that up. And ever since, there has been a very powerful consensus in the courts, the bar, the agencies, antitrust practitioners and businesses that have to deal with the very severe antitrust remedies and comply with the law, that the focus on competition rather than competitors and the ability to defend oneself based on facts and circumstances and the willingness of the courts to listen, at least listen to economic arguments, those are critical to successful application of the antitrust laws to the economy, not to destroy the economy, but to help it grow. And the Supreme Court and other courts have shown very great flexibility and understanding in absorbing new economic learning and applying it to even the high technology industries, as in the Microsoft case, the two Microsoft cases that were litigated in the 1990s and the latter one resolved in 2001. And most recently, for example, in the Ohio versus American Express case. It's not a right, left, Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative issue. Successful implementation of the mandate for competition in the antitrust laws encourages innovation, which is the main driver of economic growth, and ensures that our economy continues to grow and prosper. And so I want to associate myself with Representative Sensenbrenner's remarks. I think things are very well positioned, and I would caution aggressively against any extensive intervention in our common law system of interpreting the mandate of our basic antitrust.
Thank you, Mr. Lipsky. We've gone over time significantly, but the gentleman yields back. I now recognize Sally Hubbard for 5 minutes.
Chairman Cicilline, Ranking Member Sensenbrenner, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to speak with you today and for conducting this critically important investigation. Facebook, Amazon, Apple, and Google started on their paths to dominance with innovation, but you've uncovered major evidence that the platforms have used anti-competitive conduct and acquisitions to grow and maintain their monopoly power. They've violated the antitrust laws as they now stand. You've opened up Americans' eyes to the widespread harms that flow from the illegal monopolization of digital markets. Yet there's one thing that most Americans still can't see: what our lives, economy, and country could look like if these markets were open and competitive. We've been under monopoly rule for so long that we're suffering from a crisis of imagination. So let's take a moment and envision the possibilities of what America could be. I see an America where anyone can pursue an innovative business idea, get it funded, and build a company that doesn't get crushed by giants protecting their turf. Diverse ideas and founders flourish. Small and big companies can decline platforms' extractive terms of dealing, stop paying them taxes and tolls, reap the rewards of their ingenuity, and pay their employees more. Strong antitrust enforcement creates new waves of innovation, like when the government broke up AT&T and when US v. Microsoft paved the way for Google to exist by stopping Microsoft from taking over every market that touched its monopoly. I see an America where creators of all types, from musicians to journalists, enjoy the fruits of their labor, no longer siphoned off by big tech. I see an America where no company has concentrated control over speech. Public discourse flows freely, not subject to business models that boost divisive and incendiary content, where when we all see the same speech, we can respond to it with counter speech as the First Amendment requires. This vision of America can be ours if we defeat the robber barons of today, just like we've done before using the antitrust laws. Some say antitrust isn't the right solution and some other fix is the answer. But we are in a crisis. This isn't an either-or situation. It's a both-and situation. We must attack monopoly rule from every angle. For example, we also need privacy laws. But regulation doesn't work when monopolists are too powerful to comply or when monopolists shape the laws themselves. Others say antitrust is being weaponized for improper purposes. But Senator Sherman always intended to save America from kings of commerce. And if we open up markets by ending platforms' anti-competitive tactics and deals, a wide range of benefits will follow. Enforcing the antitrust laws won't magically solve all of our problems, but we won't be able to cure America's ills if we don't first disperse monopolies' concentrated power by unlocking competition. Of course, the tech giants each provide useful services, but providing some benefits does not give them a free pass to break the antitrust laws. Unfortunately, our laws have been attacked by the courts for decades, making enforcement expensive and hard. Even so, enforcers need to bring more cases and be more willing to risk losing in court. Ultimately, we are depending on you, Congress, to fix this. Congress should use bright line rules and presumptions to remove complexity and make antitrust cases easier, faster, and cheaper. Congress should overrule legal precedent that imposes obstacles for monopolization and merger cases. Congress should also structurally eliminate the platform's conflicts of interest and remove their incentive and ability to self-preference. It should separate platforms from commerce and divest business lines. The U.S. has used structural separation as a standard regulatory tool and antitrust remedy in networked industries. Congress should require the platforms to offer equal access on equal terms to all, protecting citizens as sellers of goods and services, consumers, and as speakers. Lawmakers should open up competition through interoperability. And immediately, in order to preserve our elections, Congress should ban the surveillance-based hyper-targeting of content. Advertising should be done based on context, not identity. This is a turning point for our nation. Our democracy is hanging in the balance. The time to act is now, decisively and with courage. Speaking to my fellow Americans, in order for your elected representatives to stand up to monopoly power, they need you behind them. The tech giants have endless lobbying funds, but we the people can once again rise up and prevail against monopolists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Hubbard. Thank you all for your opening statements, and now we'll begin questioning under the 5-minute rule, and I will begin with the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Nadler. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I said in my opening statement, I strongly believe that we must modernize our antitrust laws to meet the challenges of the modern economy. We must update the antitrust laws to reiterate as Justice Thurgood Marshall said, that antitrust laws are the Magna Carta of free enterprise that are as important to the preservation of economic freedom and our free enterprise system as the Bill of Rights is to the protection of our fundamental personal freedoms. What do each of you think is the most important thing we can do from a legislative standpoint to address the deficiencies of current antitrust law? Start with Mr.
Baer.
Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly, I think we need to modify the standard by which we judge mergers. The current law says mergers that may tend substantially to reduce competition are problematic. But the way the courts have interpreted that, they've read the word tend out of the law. I think if we move to a materially reduced competition standard, that will help us attack more anti-competitive mergers. Second thing, I think, is to deal with Section 2 of the Sherman Act, and basically where a company gets of a certain size and engages in conduct that appears to have a significant effect on limiting opportunities for rivals, that needs to be a potential cause of action where the courts will evaluate whether the pro-competitive benefits, or whatever that behavior is, are vastly outweighed by the potential harm to consumers and to competition. That's where I would focus on those two areas.
There are three primary areas of focus. The first, especially since we are talking about big tech, is structural separation. I think that's quite urgent. And again, your investigation has shown the incredible abuses of platforms that are also allowed to own companies that compete on those platforms. That's major legislation that I think this body should push. Second, the series of cases, some of which were just mentioned, the cases, the predatory pricing trio of cases, I think is really important. This is the Brook Group, Weyerhaeuser, and other cases that made it incredibly hard to prove that companies are engaged in predation. That's important to overturn, along with Trinco, Twombly, the series of cases which I and others have outlawed, and I would approach those as a set, which comes to my third point, which is that I would be very clear that the purpose of antitrust law includes the protection of liberty and the support of a decentralized economy, and move past the consumer welfare standard, which has not been successful over the last 40 years. I said three, but the fourth thing that I think we need to do in this arena is something that both Ms. Hubbard and Mr. Rahman mentioned, which is in the communications infrastructure in particular, ban targeted advertising. It's truly toxic. It's undermining our democracy.
Thank you, Mr. Baer. As you previously testified in 2016, there's been an upswing in extremely large, complex, and blatantly anti-competitive transactions that never should have made it out of the boardroom. Why is it that this trend has continued and possibly even worsened? And what can Congress or the agencies do to deter companies from brazenly proposing transactions that are so clearly anti-competitive?
As I said earlier, Mr. Chairman, I think the standard as interpreted by the courts, the current standard of Clayton Act, our merger statute, the courts have sort of applied a one-way ratchet that gets tougher and tougher for the government successfully to challenge mergers. It is nearly impossible to challenge today an acquisition by a dominant firm of a nascent competitor, something that isn't a large rival today, but could well be tomorrow. Legislative changes that basically make it clear that once a firm achieves a certain dominance, that the burden shifts to justify that its acquisition of small potential rival, we think Facebook, right? Instagram and WhatsApp, they need to justify why this isn't a problematic merger, why it doesn't eliminate somebody who, either on its own or together with merging with somebody else, might well become an alternative platform to a dominant platform today.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman, you're back. I now recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Sensenbrenner, for 5
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Lipsky, what shortcomings in the antitrust laws, if any, prevented the Obama-Biden era regulations from examining or blocking some of the transactions that have been scrutinized by this investigation? For instance, when Facebook acquired Instagram, it was greenlit by the FTC. I'm not asking you to second-guess that decision, but rather to discuss whether the existing antitrust laws were insufficient to allow for a proper review.
Thank you, Ranking Member Sensenbrenner. My view is that there are no deficiencies in the antitrust laws. In fact, over the years, the legal apparatus built up for the prevention of anti-competitive mergers has become truly formidable. There was some initial question that the Sherman Act, as passed, applied to corporate transactions, but any doubt about that was eliminated with passage of the Clayton Act in 1914. And then again, the standards were, the Clayton Act was broadened and the standards were clarified by the Seller-Kefauver amendments to the Clayton Act in 1950. And then in 1976, you had Hart-Scott-Rodino, which essentially made it impossible for any significant transaction to be consummated until the federal authorities had been notified of the nature of the transaction, the competitive activities of the parties, and given a very ample opportunity with tremendous discovery powers to investigate and to go to court prior to consummation of the transaction.
So you're saying that the existing statutes at the time of the Facebook, Instagram buyout were sufficient to do a proper review?
I do say that.
Okay, now, Mr. Baer, this was before your time as chief honcho in the antitrust division, but I think you were around at the time. Would you care to respond to that? As I indicated, Mr. Sensenbrenner, my law school classmate and friend Tad Lipsky and I have a bit of a disagreement on this. I do think you look at Instagram or WhatsApp, and you look at some of the documents that were revealed in this subcommittee's most recent hearing. These were companies that potentially either on their own or in combination with other companies had potential to be rivals. It wasn't clear they were going to be, but by allowing Facebook to grab these folks up when they're small, Facebook, I think, according to the documents your investigation has uncovered, recognize these firms as potential rivals. Current law does not allow the FTC or my old place, the Antitrust Division, to challenge those transactions. You need to be a significant actual potential competitor in the marketplace in order for antitrust laws to apply. I'm sorry, go ahead.
You're essentially saying that the law that was in effect at the time, which I don't think has been significantly changed then, prevented the enforcement during the Obama years.
That's correct. And I think modest changes to the current statute would allow us to go after those kind of acquisitions by dominant firms.
Do you know if DOJ requested an amendment to those laws so that they could be more active in enforcing them?
I think while I was there, that debate was just beginning, and as I've watched what's happened to the antitrust laws since then, the way the courts have, as I indicated, this one-way ratchet, imposing more and more conditions on the government to meet its burden of proof, that we are at a place where some tweaks to the antitrust laws would help the courts understand better what the congressional intent was at the time and is today. I'm sorry to filibuster here.
Okay, Senator. I guess, my observation on this is that, we hear from DOJ and FTC all the time when they think laws are inadequate, and then they come and crack the whip on us to say, let's get it fixed right away, not tomorrow, but yesterday. And there wasn't any real move on the Department of Justice or the FTC to get those laws fixed if this merger prevented an enforcement of the laws.
You know, the final point I'd like to make is, you know, I think that antitrust law has to continue to be focused on consumer welfare rather than deviating into other problem areas. If we go back to the basics and enforce those basics, a lot of the complaints that we heard during the previous hearing when CEOs were here never would have existed. And I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the distinguished gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for hosting this hearing. It's been a very important hearing, and it's been a very important topic, and it's time for Congress to act. And I'm happy to be a part of this monumental effort. Mr. Rahman, in July, I asked Apple CEO Tim Cook about Apple's power and control over the App Store. I'm still troubled that in order to sell in the App Store, Apple forces app developers to comply with rules it makes up as it goes along. It develops and sells apps that compete with the app developers who need to be in the App Store in order to gain access to the 100 million Americans who use iPhones. And it also forces those app developers to pay a 30%. It holds them over a barrel and makes them pay 30% of whatever they get out of the App Store for selling their products. So it's like the fox owning the hen house and pimping the chickens and then eating the chickens. Mr. Rahman, in your written statement, you addressed the concept of gateway power as a type of infrastructure power that the antitrust laws should address. Can you elucidate a little more on gateway power and how the App Store exploits its gateway power?
Yeah, thank you very much, Congressman. And it's such an important question because I think all of the platforms that we're talking about in these hearings have this type of gateway power. And I love the metaphor you used, the fox owning the hen house. The way this works is if you build the kind of infrastructure that everybody needs to access basic goods and services, in this case, the App Store, same argument you can make about Facebook or Google, because we all need to get entry into that marketplace, if I'm an app developer, that means that the owner of the App Store, the person who controls the gates, has a lot of control, a lot of power and can make unreasonable demands, right, on anyone who needs to get access to that marketplace, to that ecosystem. And so that they may not always use that power benevolently, they may not always use it in an extractive way, but they have that power nonetheless because they have something that any entrepreneur, business developer needs, which is access to the marketplace. So this is why I think it's so important that any remedy include some basic rules of the road, that if you build that kind of infrastructure and you own the gateway, the access point, it's incumbent upon you as the firm who controls that gateway to observe basic standards of fair treatment, of non-discrimination, and so forth. And that would provide regulators with the tools, if Congress provided them, tools to enforce against those types of practices.
Thank you. Mr. Teachout, Amazon has much the same relationship with vendors on its platform. Can you tell us your thoughts about how this works and how consumers are harmed, how small businesses are harmed, and what Congress should do in order to alleviate this imbalance in our commerce?
Thank you. There are, I believe, about 2 million small business owners that depend upon Amazon to get their goods to market. And your investigation, along with the research of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, has shown that Amazon charges as much as 30% of every sale. Amazon takes as much as 30% of every sale when those sellers sell on Amazon on average. This is essentially a form of private tax. And when you talk to Amazon sellers, as you have, you hear about the incredible fear that Amazon sellers have and a kind of rational paranoia about how the algorithms are treating them, and their own beliefs that they need to purchase ancillary Amazon services, something that your investigation revealed is a legitimate belief, as Bezos admitted that the use of fulfillment has an impact on the algorithm for the sellers. And that's really dangerous for democracy, but it also leads to inequality, because that is essentially Amazon standing like at the narrowest point in the pathway at a choke point moment and demanding a 30% of every sale.
Thank you. Mrs. Hubbard, do you believe Section 2 of the Sherman Act is sufficient to address the conduct that we are discussing?
The time of the gentleman has expired, but the witness may answer the question.
Thank you, Congressman. I do not believe Section 2 is sufficient because the self-preferencing and self-prioritization is so rampant that it's basically a game of whack-a-mole. There's just a myriad of ways that these owners of the platforms can privilege their own products and services, and it's nearly impossible to police them all. Not to mention because often it's being done through algorithms that are not transparent and are completely opaque. So that's why I advocate for the structural separation as a way to remove the incentive and ability of these platforms to prioritize their own products and services.
Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I recognize the distinguished gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Buck, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. I appreciate the bipartisan and thorough nature in which you have conducted this investigation. I want to start by reiterating one of the nation's most important founding principles. As Professor Teachout noted, Congress writes our laws and the courts interpret those laws. In the words of my fellow Coloradan Justice Gorsuch, judges wear robes, not capes. The American people elect their representatives every 2 years. Our constituents hold us accountable for our votes in a way that judges are not. It's worth remembering this as we examine big tech's anti-competitive action and our nation's antitrust regime more broadly. It's clear that our antitrust enforcement agencies have hobbled themselves by observing judicial interpretations instead of adhering to the letter of the law, which hampers enforcement agencies' ability to bring cases against industries that do not have a defined price structure or offer free services like big tech. Congress did not intend for regulators to only bring antitrust cases based on price differential. In fact, lawmakers intentionally wrote the Sherman and Clayton Acts with an open-ended consumer welfare framework to enable antitrust enforcement agencies to bring cases also related to quality, output, consumer choice, or potential innovation in the marketplace. Following this original standard would allow regulators to review big tech mergers that offer free services while relying on selling user data or make acquisitions based on potential competition. Data presented by McKinsey & Company further shows how dangerous relying solely on price change doctrine can harm the economy. McKinsey's data shows that return on capital in many industries, including restaurants, auto parts stores, department stores, and oil and gas companies, has remained nearly steady over the past 50 years. However, 2 industries show rapid growth: big pharma and big tech. There is a breakdown occurring in the digital economy. A small number of tech titans are using anti-competitive means to grow their marketplace dominance and control the channels of distribution. Our nation's law enforcement agencies can't keep pace. For example, Facebook's acquisition of Instagram was allowed to proceed primarily because there was no defined price change to the consumer. This review didn't take into account Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg's stating his desire to purchase Instagram centered on buying an up-and-coming competitor before they could overtake Facebook's market-dominant position. This case shows exactly why the current price-focused model of antitrust enforcement misses the mark and fails to account for potential innovation and consumer choice. Congress should lead the way with a meaningful solution to ensure our enforcement agencies are adhering to the original intent of the law, not judicial interpretations. If we don't provide constructive action to address these issues, the progressive left will undoubtedly push for an oppressive regulatory regime. A new Dodd-Frank, along with a CFPB-like agency, Overseeing the internet will only benefit big tech firms and harm future innovation. This shouldn't be the only action Congress takes, though. This committee should work together to ensure our antitrust regulators have the tools and resources necessary to conduct meaningful oversight and successfully bring enforcement cases against bad actors. Currently, the FTC and DOJ antitrust divisions' combined enforcement budget stands at approximately $510 million. Conducting effective oversight and launching antitrust reviews is difficult when your budget is only a minor fraction of big tech's approximately $2 trillion market share and unfailingly deep pockets to combat litigation, comply with regulatory requirements, and pay expert witnesses. Our law enforcement agencies can't keep up with this onslaught. Congress should consider allocating more funds to the FTC and DOJ to ensure that they have the proper resources to conduct serious investigations and enforce antitrust laws. We should also work to ensure these agencies can recruit and retain the best possible talent to achieve the mission. We also need to seriously consider increasing scrutiny on big tech companies, including shifting the burden of proof required for a market-dominant company to prove that a merger is not anti-competitive. These changes may stop market-dominant companies from further consolidating the tech center in an anti-competitive manner. As a conservative, I want to see Congress reassert its Article I duties to write our nation's law. As a former prosecutor, I understand how important it is for our nation's law enforcement agencies to have the tools necessary to fight and win these cases. It's clear that the ball is in Congress's courts. Companies like Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Twitter have acted anti-competitively. We need to rise to the occasion to offer the American people a solution that promotes free and fair competition. Ms. Bovard, could you please offer your thoughts on these proposals?
Thank you, Congressman. I think you make a couple of really lucid points that are worth emphasizing. We do expect our enforcement agencies to parry with billion-dollar companies, that the biggest the world has ever seen, and we give them minuscule budgets to do it. The $10 trillion, or the $2 trillion that you mentioned, is about 10% of US GDP, and that's the tech sector. We need to give our enforcement agencies, I think, the resources and commitment from Congress to pursue their full mandate in this space. And I would also add that I think a little bit of humility from our enforcement agencies is necessary, that they may not have always gotten it right. If you look at the last 20 years, there have been about 750 acquisitions that have taken place with relatively little scrutiny. And Bill Kovacic, who is a George W. Bush appointee to the FTC, who voted actually to approve the Google acquisition of DoubleClick in 2008, recently told the New York Times, and I want to make sure I quote him correctly, "If I knew in 2007 what I know now, I would have voted to challenge the DoubleClick acquisition." And this tells me that everything that you said is pretty on point. We need to make sure these agencies have the resources to do it, and also that they're not hamstringing themselves by raising the bar on themselves with the laws that currently exist. Section 7 of the Clayton Act, which I think you referenced, is actually a fairly generous standard when it comes to mergers and acquisitions. To quote it, "The effect of such acquisition may be substantially to lessen competition or tend to create a monopoly." It doesn't specify price competition alone, and it doesn't raise the evidentiary bar on potential completion versus actual competition. So I would like to align myself with your statement, and thank you for the question.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here for what is such an important hearing. I think technology offers us the promise of freedom, and yet over and over again in these hearings, we've heard about people and businesses that are trapped. Small businesses that can never quite get a fair shake, news sites that lose ad revenue, or other websites that lose viewers because of unregulated practices or conflicts of interest in the many roles of these platforms that disadvantage innovation and competition, and would-be innovators and developers have to make products that cater to major tech companies or face the real threat of being copied and crushed. No one likes to feel trapped, but right now I think many people do. And our democracy is trapped too. Ms. Teachout, let me start with you. In other sectors of the economy, like in healthcare markets, Congress has developed legislation that makes certain conduct presumptively illegal, and there's been quite a bit of discussion about this through these questions. Do you think a law that would make certain types of mergers presumptively illegal, shifting the burden to the merging parties to prove the transaction would not be harmful to competition, could be an effective remedy?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Yes. You know, in the field where I come from, democracy law and anti-corruption law, prophylactic rules are actually absolutely essential. You don't investigate every time there's a $2,700, if you had to investigate every time there was a $10,000 direct campaign contribution, whether there was something problematic, you would never actually be able to protect against corruption in the campaign finance sphere. So I think it's really important to think about these kinds of prophylactic rules, including the one you talked about, to really shift the burdens. Thank you.
Mr. Baer, I saw you nodding. Did you want to add anything to that?
Just that I think as antitrust lawyers, we tend to think of antitrust law enforcement as often the only solution to a problem. And there may well be prospective rules. In my testimony, I talked about the FCC rule, basically saying our phone numbers actually were our phone numbers and we could port them elsewhere. That was a prospective rule. It was not a law enforcement action. Basically, there are ways to promote interoperability in a fashion that may channel competition in constructive ways.
Thank you. Mr. Rahman, I don't believe that many people make the necessary connections that they should between antitrust law and racial equity and economic equity. How would making changes to the antitrust laws help us to empower Black and Brown communities in particular that have been burdened throughout our history with structural inequities?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for that question. It's such an important link to be made. The antitrust laws we're talking about here really are one of those foundational rules of the road that if we don't change them, we actually leave in place many of the structural inequities along the lines of race that you talked about. So 3 very quick ways that I would name that are connected around economic opportunity, around labor and the treatment of workers, and around racist forms of algorithmic bias. So the first piece, this whole point about accessing the marketplace, the new digital infrastructure that we talked about, the burden falls here, monopoly power's burden falls especially hard on small and medium businesses, and in particular on Black and Brown businesses. If you look at the challenges of business formation, of staying alive and afloat, especially in this kind of an economy, it's the same kind of challenges that we're seeing hitting Black and Brown businesses in response to, say, the COVID economy collapse. Solving this in an antitrust policy approach would actually help jumpstart small business formation. That's number one. Number two, in terms of workers, we haven't talked about it much yet today, but monopoly power is actually one of the key drivers of the suppression of wages and also the perpetuation of low labor standards, workplace safety standards in particular. And when we look at the plight of essential workers, Black and Brown workers in this moment, whether they're Amazon workers or workers of other dominant firms, breaking up monopoly power actually is critical to empowering Black and Brown workers. And finally, the kinds of toxic spread of white nationalism, of extremism online and information platforms like Facebook is fundamentally tied to the ad-based business model that Facebook has. And if we're trying to build a racially inclusive public sphere, we have to tackle the monopoly power that Facebook has.
Thank you so much. Ms. Hubbard, you argue in your testimony for aggressive antitrust enforcement against platform monopolists. Can you talk a little bit about the structural separation and how it would help small businesses, new tech startups, and consumers if we were to implement that?
The time of the gentlelady has expired, but the witness may answer the question.
I think you may be
you're on mute, maybe, Ms. Hubbard.
Thank you, Congresswoman. As we've heard today, small businesses, entrepreneurs, citizens are all beholden to these tech companies and are forced to play by their rules, often paying them, which is the equivalent of taxes. You know, the 30% tax that Zephyr Teachout mentioned, the amount that every small business has to pay just to appear in Google search results under their own name is a huge tax on small business. So what we have are small businesses paying taxes to these huge companies And those companies don't, in turn, pay their own fair share of taxes. So structurally separating the platforms from the commerce will give everyone a fair shot at innovating, at getting the fair rewards of reaping the rewards of their hard work. And it will be good for consumers because consumers are human beings and they benefit from the choice, innovation, and quality that robust competition brings. And they're also citizens that benefit from the free flow of speech, and they're workers and employees of companies that benefit when the platform extraction ceases. So we can't think of consumers only in one role because it doesn't make any sense to care about whether I pay low prices, but not care about whether I'm getting paid less. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Hubbard.
Thank you. I yield back.
General A. Beck. I recognize the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's just through the course of this investigation that it's obvious that there's bipartisan agreement that there's serious competition concerns in digital marketplaces. We may differ on whether ex-ante antitrust remedies are sufficient for some of these. I like Mr. Baer talking about tweaks versus large-scale change. But I mean, at the very least, I'd like to know whether our current antitrust enforcement is capable of addressing at least some of these concerns. And I'm glad you did the double-click quote, other than you stole it from me, and I'm going to probably do it again. But I think over the past 2 decades, there's been, a lack of antitrust enforcement in digital markets. And to illustrate, when we were talking about Google's acquisition of DoubleClick in 2007, it was permitted by the FTC. The acquisition allowed Google to leap forward in third-party digital display advertising, where it previously only enjoyed considerable market share in search advertising. And there's an argument to be made that nobody could foresee the future competition concerns at the time, that the third-party ad markets were relatively competitive. However, the FTC majority opinion in that case acknowledged that with DoubleClick, Google could engage in a number of potential anti-competitive strategies to further enhance its positions in various markets. The commission dismissed the concern that Google would bundle or tie parts of its growth ad tech stack. And that concern was hypothetical in 2007, but now we know that it was a very real consequence of Google's acquisition. And I said during our last hearing, the major part of this investigation is dealing exactly with those things. And when we talk about like Instagram or WhatsApp or Messenger, it's easy to see those things, but a lot of these acquisitions are of very small companies at the time. And it only gets to be a problem when it's in the aggregate. And I mean, with Google on the ad tech stack, it was both on the buy and sell side, which means they just simply have too much control over advertising. And in the case, though, the commission also dismissed an additional concern that consolidation of ad tech stack would create a network effect whereby Google's position would make it more attractive to advertisers, which in turn would make it more attractive to publishers and so on and so on and so on. Google's ad tech informed by a vast majority of the user data, and they got it from their first-party services in Google Maps and Chrome. Meanwhile, Google has consolidated its market share by cutting off third parties and cookies. And I will say this every time I bring up the word cookie. I do not want to be the congressman responsible for bringing them back. But there's no doubt that it consolidated their market share. And I'm not even saying the FTC was right or wrong in that decision, but I'm pointing out the FTC was aware of the concerns, which turned out to be proven correct, did not do any enforcement in the subsequent years. And even though the majority FTC opinion concluded by promising to watch the online advertising market closely in the future. And that was, I think, towards William Kovachek's quote. If he'd known then what he knew in 2007, he would not have voted to challenge, or he would have voted to challenge that. And since 2007, Google spent billions of dollars to acquire a lot of other key ad tech firms, some big, some small. This is one anecdote, however, there's similar stories and concerns throughout the digital marketplace. The DOJ right now, though, and FTC are conducting investigations and suits are reportedly imminent. That seems to me to be at least the most aggressive antitrust enforcement we've seen in decades. And I concur with my friend Ken Buck from Colorado. This is one area where I do think we need more money, more resources, more enforcement. Mr. Baer, your testimony discusses additional resources for after-action studies, which obviously this would be easier on the front end, but sometimes that's not always realistic. where agencies did not, and studies of what have happened in markets where agencies did not bring enforcement actions. Can you elaborate how an after-action review of an instance like DoubleClick merger would result in better antitrust enforcement?
Absolutely, sir. The best example is hospital consolidation. We saw the courts hostile to the creation of monopolies or near monopolies in local markets as hospitals chains combined over the course of the 80s and 90s. Tim Muris, Republican chairman of the FTC, commissioned after-action studies of what those markets looked like after consolidation occurred, and the courts had rejected the FTC's merger challenge. They found dramatic price increases in those markets. It established the FTC was right. In subsequent hospital merger challenges, the FTC was able to go to court, use those economic studies, and demonstrate, hey, this risk is real, and the courts responded.
Thank you. And at the risk, because and it wasn't just DoubleClick though. It was AdMob in 2009, AdMeld in 2011, Adametry in 2014. And so when you were talking about tweaking on mergers and changing the standard, I'm interested in having that conversation possibly offline, because I'm not sure any one of these meet it initially. But when you look back, I think in some instances, we're going to have to figure out a way to deal with that. And I know that's not ideal. You see it right now with Instagram and Messenger trying to combine their data. Well, that's going to be, just practically it makes it harder to intertwine. But do you think after-action reports, considering how these companies work, are a key part to enforcement moving forward?
It's a key tool, but in addition, statutory changes which would require a dominant firm to offer an affirmative justification for its acquisition of smaller, nascent competitors would actually empower the antitrust agencies to address that potential accumulation over time of significant enhanced market power.
My only concern with that is that a lot of these companies build themselves solely for the purpose of getting bought out. Eventually we get into a capitalized. We saw that with the Sprint T-Mobile merger. It was never a question between 4 and 3. It was going to be a question between 4 and 2. But I've used too much. Thank you, sir.
Oh, I thank the gentleman. The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the distinguished gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Demings, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much to our witnesses for being with us today. Mr. Baer, it's always so important. We would have never thought, of course, 20 years ago, when we really 30, 40 years ago, when we really began, that we would have companies that have grown, or mergers that would grow so huge until they really affected everybody else in an adverse way around them. You talked about that sometimes the fear of getting it wrong really kind of stifles our ability to do what we need to do in this space. Could you please expound on that a little bit, and also talk a bit about the path forward, the fear of getting it wrong?
Well, thank you, and thank you for reminding me I've been at this business over 40 years. But the fear of getting it wrong is sort of an outgrowth of an overreach by the Chicago School of Economics. It's basically the notion that unless we're 100% certain that there's an antitrust problem, we should stay back. And that has been infused into the thinking of the courts. I don't blame the courts for that thinking. It is just this one-way ratchet, which has gotten tougher and tougher for the government or a plaintiff to prove up an antitrust case. And that's why I conclude that one of the key solutions has to be Congress stepping forward and instructing the courts that, no, we meant if there's a tendency to substantially reduce competition, you should act. The courts need to intervene. So it's that hesitation about getting it wrong, avoidance of what they call type 1 errors of over-enforcement, that I think has shifted the pendulum way to the wrong side.
You also talked about additional resources, or the need for additional resources. Why should Congress give additional resources when many of the companies that we're talking about have not appropriately used the resources that they have effectively for enforcement efforts?
Look, one can always criticize the Federal Trade Commission, where I once worked, the Antitrust Division, where I once worked, for not doing it exactly right. But I think they have used the resources Congress has appropriated them, in most cases, quite appropriately. The problem is those resources are so small in comparison to the size of the economy, to the number of acquisitions going on, to the behaviors this subcommittee is properly investigating and properly concerned about. So you look at the ratio suggests we need to strike the balance a little differently.
Thank you. Mr. Cadies, you talked about the need for reform and not just enforcement, and thinking about legislation to revitalize our country's antitrust law. What do you think are the most important principles right now that Congress should consider?
I should remember that. Thank you, Congresswoman. I think you want to think about this in the big picture as you have a court that continually doesn't want to enforce the law. I think the way the bipartisan in this committee thinks it should be enforced. So the first thing you have to do is you need laws that will strip back decisions that limit antitrust enforcement. Professor Teachout talked about Trinco. There's a whole list. The second thing you want to do is something along the lines what Bill Baer suggested is you want to tweak the statute because at least that sends a signal you're doing it wrong. And then the third thing I think you want to do where you can, this may sound small but is very powerful, is you create presumptions where you are more concerned about the harm from the conduct than the potential costs of over-enforcement. And so in that sense, the way you deal with what Congressman Armstrong's deal was, you want the FTC to be more aggressive when they see something like a double click that looks new. You give them the tool that they don't have to go in and disprove every potential benefit. The company has to come forward and say, yeah, we understand there's a problem. We have to show you it's a good thing. So I think it's those three things.
Could you also finally talk a little bit about how you believe interoperability could help?
Right, so I think that the interesting thing about interoperability is not as a solution itself. And it's one of these things, I know Professor Yu talked about how hard it is, but it's amazing the way companies can find interoperability when it suits their purposes. So right, I can call you on the telephone, I can text you, we don't have to be on the same system. But if you're not on Facebook, somehow I can't put up a post on Facebook that goes to you if I want to friend you. Like that's apparently technologically impossible. But if I could, it means if you don't like Facebook, or as Congressman Jordan talks about not liking the way they engage in censorship, you can walk away from Facebook and you don't lose contact with all your friends, right? And so that allows competition to occur, and that has the benefit of reducing the incentives and the ability to exclude competition.
Great. Thank you so much. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stubbe, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My questions are for Ms. Bovard. In May of this year, President Trump issued an executive order to prevent online censorship. The executive order discusses Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Ms. Bovard, have big tech companies abused Section 230 to their advantage?
Well, thank you for the question, Congressman, and the short answer, I believe, is yes. When conservatives think about Section 230, I think it's important to point out that the statute, kind of reflecting the conversation we're having here, has become so judicially distorted from what Congress initially passed that what we rely on for its application today is very bloated, and a bulletproof immunity exists where a porous, narrow one was originally passed. So it is my view that yes, the companies have abused this practice to the extent that it is now referred to as an implicit financial subsidy to these companies.
Well, so you kind of touched on it there. Can you explain other ways that Section 230 has been misused and wrongly applied?
Well, I think as I outlined in my written statement, Section 230 has originally passed as the Good Samaritan standard, has actually allowed a lot of bad Samaritans a lot of cover. There's been well-documented evidence of the fact that, sex trafficking, all kinds of human trafficking, terrorism, revenge pornography, all flourishes on these platforms, and the companies are immune from any liability for it. In 2018, Congress passed FOSTA SESTA to make them liable for knowingly participating in the facilitation of sex trafficking, but there's a whole lot of other criminal and lewd and harassing content that occurs, and these companies, as opposed to being the good Samaritan that could, walk by and help the guy out of the ditch, they can walk right by and there's no consequence.
How does the president's executive order seek to promote free speech and rectify this online censorship issue that's been discussed?
So the president's executive order does two things that I think are very important. The first is that it, petitions, has NTIA petition the FCC to bring Section 230's application back to its original intent, which, as we discussed, is a very narrow immunity focused on the original title of the amendment itself, which is the Family Online Empowerment Act, allowing basically you to clean up the internet. And the second thing it does that I think is really important is it enforces a measure of transparency onto these companies. A lot of the censorship and bias they get away with happens because they don't have to tell us what they're doing. They've never popped the hood and let us look in. And they could. They could put allegations of bias to bed if they let us look under the hood of what they're doing, but they don't. So I think that transparency is also very important.
Do you believe that Section 230 reform is an avenue for addressing some of these online censorship issues?
I do, because it enforces accountability and transparency on companies who right now have none of it. And I think companies that can upset half of their user base without consequence because they know they have nowhere else to go deserve a little bit of accountability and transparency requirements for a substantial benefit, a government-mandated privilege that they receive.
What specific reforms should Congress consider when examining ways to address the pitfalls with Section 230?
So I think the proposal that Ranking Member Jordan mentioned in his opening statement, I think sounds like a very good place to start. It deals with the otherwise objectionable part of Section 230, which again has become this sort of massive catch-all for the companies to enforce against viewpoints they don't like without any consequence. I think addressing that particular part of the law, I think, will be very useful. And again, I think the transparency, when you have to show what you're doing, when you have to show your work, it's a lot harder just to say, trust me, to no consequence. You actually have to show conservatives that you're listening to them.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for being here today. I'd yield any of my remaining time to Ranking Member Jordan.
You'll yield back. I now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Neguse. No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I want to come to Ms. Teachout. Welcome, Professor Teachout. In your testimony, you advocate what you call structural separation, a Glass-Steagall approach to antitrust in this field. Why has Congress approached concentrated markets like financial services or telecom this way in the past? And what is its resonance with American constitutional principles of structural separation of powers?
Thank you for your question. What we've seen in the past, you mentioned Glass-Steagall, which I also mentioned in my written testimony. You also see laws like the Public Utility Holding Act, which prohibits companies who are subject to the act, who play the sort of central public utility role, from engaging in acquisitions unless there's an SEC approval. And the key theory here is that you don't want conflicts of interest at the heart of your economy with essential infrastructures. You don't want your pipelines to have a conflict with what is going through those pipelines. And decentralizing that power, instead having platforms that enable competition on those platforms instead of using those to kill, acquire, or copy, as you've shown in your investigation, is really important for both for allowing the thriving of small businesses, but also from stopping these platforms from becoming a form of private government. And this is something that Justice Douglas spoke about, the inevitable tendency of all private power to form a government in and of itself. Structural separation is one of the key tools to prohibit these private powers from becoming private governments that coexist with our democratic government.
Well, would that undermine innovation? Would it undermine competition? Would it harm consumers?
Well, in general, I would say that the more feudal a system is, the less innovation you're going to see. And what we're talking about, when you talk about the democratic threat, it's essentially a feudal threat, that you see Amazon playing a feudal role, Facebook playing a really dangerous feudal role, deciding which newspapers get prioritization in your news feed, YouTube playing this role. And the more you see a feudal system, actually the more you see a closed and fearful system and a less innovative system. So yes.
But tell us about what you think the role of Congress is today and historically in the development of antitrust principles. If Congress doesn't do it, what happens if we're not updating and modernizing the antitrust laws?
Yeah, I mean, Congress from the 1890s, 1880s onward has played this really central role, recognizing that protecting fairness and a thriving economy is the quintessential congressional role, and also protecting our democracy and protecting the corruption of the takeover of these forms of private government is a quintessential congressional role. And then starting in the 80s, you saw Congress really step back from this role. You saw this deep depoliticization. Instead, when these cases came down, cases we've been talking about today, whether the cases involving predatory pricing or changes to merger law, you didn't see congressional hearing. There was a kind of tacit acceptance that the Supreme Court was the right institution to be making decisions about the shape of our economy. This is a terrible institution to be making decisions about the shape of our economy. That said, I do want to address some of the, something that has not been addressed enough, I think. I think Congress's other role is to light a fire under enforcement agencies. I would not allow enforcement agencies to get away with saying that, although the laws, the court has made these laws harder to enforce, the FTC can engage in much more aggressive rule-making, much more aggressive enforcement. In fact, I would say that your investigation has shown some really deep failures in the aggressiveness of the FTC. So I think there is a double role. One is ongoing investigations and ongoing responsibility-taking for the structures of power and the structures of the economy here in Congress. And second is ongoing oversight and lighting a fire under the agencies in an ongoing way.
Well, are there benefits to a regime where you have multiple levers of enforcement in the federal bureaucratic context, state attorneys general, private plaintiffs? Do you want to try to multiply the different sources of enforcement?
Yeah, time of the gentleman has expired, but the witness may answer the question.
It's absolutely essential to multiply levers of enforcement. In fact, in the first Congress of this country, about half the laws had qui tam provisions because there was concern about capture or corruption of impossible enforcement agencies. So you need to have a dynamic interaction with broad private rights of action, state attorneys general, agencies, and Congress all constantly engaging instead of passively accepting the Supreme Court and big companies taking over this area.
I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Ohio for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Bovard, is cancel culture real?
It certainly is, sir.
Recent survey, 62% of the American people said they're afraid to freely express their thoughts and opinions. I think most Americans agree that it's darn real, it's scary. I think Professor Teachout I think the quote she just said, closed and fearful system that we find ourselves in. If 62% of the American people are afraid to express themselves, do you have a functioning First Amendment?
You don't. It would seem that would violate the very intent of the First Amendment, which is to provide a robust protection for speech of all kinds.
Yeah, silence is not the First Amendment, and that's exactly what the cancel culture mob is wanting. They're wanting us to be silent. In fact, I think it's even worse. They want us to agree with them. Do you have free speech if only one side is allowed to talk?
You do not. You have one source of information only. That is not free speech or free thought, I would add.
Yeah, so if you don't have free thought, you don't have free speech, you have a closed and fearful system. You have a system where 62% of the American people are afraid and reluctant to express their thoughts, their opinions. That's a dangerous place to be. Is big tech a part of this phenomena we now find ourselves in?
I would say absolutely. I think that the bias that we've discussed is a symptom, actually, of its market power. Google filters information for 92% of the world, 87% of America. So whatever they choose to amplify or suppress is what billions of Americans, billions of people around the world see. That's a problem.
It strikes me as twofold. One, they can censor themselves. We know about that. We know what Google tried to do to the Federalists. We know what Twitter will do to the President of the United States, but yet then turn around and let the Ayatollah of Iran spew the things that he wants to spew. So they can engage in it themselves, but then they also provide a platform for other people to attack and try to cancel opinions they disagree with. Now, I don't know how we deal with that. We just got to fight back and be able to use the platform and fight back with that. But that second part, Bari Weiss actually called. Bari Weiss, the individual who had to resign, or who did resign, I don't know if she had to, she resigned from the New York Times. She called that second phenomenon the digital thunderdome, a term that I just thought struck me as exactly what happens when the mob starts attacking positions they don't like. So it seems to me we come to the critical question, what's the answer? How do we address it?
Well, I think I would actually go back to something that Ms. Hubbard actually referenced in her opening statement, which is that the answer, the antidote to bad speech and suppression of speech is more speech. And I think—
Always has been in this country. Always has been.
So whatever incentives that Congress can give through the tools that, they already are involved with these tech companies with Section 230, with sort of this antitrust immunity that they've given these tech companies, whatever incentives that Congress can give these companies to abide by what we, in Section 230, designed for, right, which is robust political debate, a diversity of views, I think it's incumbent upon Congress to do that.
Seems to me I agree with that, and I want you to take a good look at the legislation I briefly referenced in my opening comments, legislation that we've introduced today. It seems to me that would be something we could all agree on, because there's definitely some disagreement. We heard what Ranking Member Sensenbrenner said. We've heard what folks on the Democrat side said about, is existing antitrust law good enough? Or the truth is, I don't know. It may be, it may not be. Do we have to change it? Well, we'll look at that. Is it more robust action, as some of the Democrat witnesses have said from the agencies? Probably all of that's important. But it seems to me we should be able to agree on Section 230 and what needs to be changed there to foster more speech and not allow these big tech companies to censor, particularly I think censor conservatives. Would you agree with that?
I would. I think there's a lot of proposals to reform Section 230, which I think reflects the sentiment that you just suggested, which is that they all have one goal, which is to force more accountability on these platforms for speech, for the criminal acts that flourish there. And I think it's a very important area to address. To your point, I do think this is a multi-pronged problem that is going to probably require multi-pronged approaches across different sectors of policymaking. Section 230 is one of them.
And you know what else I think is important? I think you have to call it out every single time you see it. Every time big tech censors somebody, it should be called out, particularly now. I mean, particularly now, 4.5 weeks before a major election. I mean, maybe the biggest election. And we know what happened in 2016. We know what Google tried to do to help the Clinton campaign. So you have to call it out every single time. And then hopefully we can get some bipartisan support for the Section 230 changes that I think everyone, we all just sit down and work, we all agree need to happen. I'll give you the last word for the last 15 seconds.
I would agree with that, because I would like to get to a point where these big tech giants don't have nearly the power they have over speech, over election, over independent behavior. I do not think we can function as a free society when we are ruled by tyrannical corporations.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to start by commending the members and the staff of this committee for the incredible work they've done over the course of this hearing series. It's an historic investigation. The report coming forward is shedding light on the crushing power of big tech and has really brought before the American people a desperately needed conversation on what do we need to do to reform our antitrust laws. So I'm proud to have been a part of this process, very grateful to the chairman for having initiated it and walked us all through this. You know, over the course of the last year, we've laid out how Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, and others have used monopolistic tactics to exert undue market power. In doing this, these companies stifle innovation, kill competition, and harm the American public. We certainly hear about it every day from our constituents. I have little reason to believe that without regulatory intervention, these companies will continue to act in their self-interest rather than in the interest of free and fair competition or privacy. Over the course of the investigation, it became clear a conversation on rethinking traditional antitrust law is needed. Companies competing in the digital marketplace on the scale we see today could not have been conceived of when the Sherman Antitrust Act and our other anti-monopoly laws were created. And decades of court rulings have obviously made it harder and harder to use traditional antitrust laws to bring enforcement measures against these companies. So in addition to looking at how we can use traditional antitrust law to bring companies to heel, we also have to identify the areas where we can make reforms to better regulate and police the digital marketplaces. So, looking forward to how we develop a modern antitrust code that can respond to the major competition issues of this time. And I'm hopeful that our report and the expert testimony of our witnesses today will serve as a launching point for enforcement and reform legislation. Now, using the predatory pricing models to drive out competition is a classic monopolistic tactic. And in our hearing in July, I raised concerns with Amazon's scheme to artificially lower the prices of diapers in order to drive down a competitor's profits until they could acquire that competitor. And this had a real impact on parents who saw, after the acquisition, saw the cost of Amazon diaper products rise as a result. So Ms. Teachout, do you see this predatory pricing scheme as a symptom of a company that's grown so large they no longer care about what's best for consumers?
As a mother of an almost 2-year-old, I feel that the diapers problem on a regular basis. So thank you for raising it. Look, the diapers acquisition, thank you for your line of questioning, which was very powerful. It was an example of the moment, one of the moments where great research and great preparation really revealed something powerful. It showed that, I believe you uncovered just how much Amazon was willing to lose in order to govern that market. And I think one of the things it showed is the really deeply problematic nature of court-driven antitrust policy. Because what we saw in Brook Group and Weyerhaeuser and these series of Supreme Court antitrust cases is a statement that predatory pricing of exactly this kind was really unlikely to happen. It was a statement based in economic theory, but not in the economic realities. And it's just an example of how incredibly important it is for this body to act to make clear that that kind of predatory pricing cannot happen going forward. Right now, we do not know the full scope and range of, I'll be quick, of predatory behaviors going on, but we have reason to suspect it's far broader than anything we know. And the opacity of these companies makes it very easy to cross-subsidize in ways that really crush competition.
And do you have suggestions about how we can use reform to combat this?
Well, sure. Overturn the trio of cases that changed the predatory pricing laws. I mean, this is something Congress does in other areas. When President Obama became president, his first bill, the Lilly Ledbetter Act, was overturning bad Supreme Court interpretation of congressional statutes. So here again, it is your responsibility to take this moment and overturn bad Supreme Court interpretation of congressional statutes.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I do have to say I'm struck by the fact that when they passed the Sherman Antitrust Law, they probably were not thinking about diaper pricing and did not have witnesses like yourself or representatives like myself. Thank you to all of our witnesses. We really appreciate your insights today, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Neguse, for 5 minutes.
Thank
And the
you,
vice chair,
Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank each of the witnesses for their testimony today and very thoughtful presentations with respect to the legislative recommendations that this committee is poised to potentially make to the full Congress. I would be remiss if I didn't say first and foremost just how much I've appreciated serving as the vice chair of this committee, particularly given the investigation that we have undertaken. And I want to give my gratitude to the chairman, to Chairman Cicilline, for his thoughtful leadership. I think the way that he has approached this investigation in leading, of course, our counsel and the staff to the committee and on a bipartisan basis working to try to get to the bottom of these very serious, vexing issues that impact every consumer in our country, in my view, has just been a tremendous example of how Congress can work well when we are working at our best. And so I want to say thank you again, Chairman Cicilline, and with the ranking member of the subcommittee as well. We appreciate his leadership and, of course, wish him well in his retirement. I want to, I guess, perhaps end the hearing in a similar way in which we started it. The ranking member asked a series of questions around Facebook in particular, and I think that Facebook provides perhaps one of the best examples for this committee and for the country really to consider in terms of acquisitions of competitive and nascent threats, undeniably helping a company amass and maintain market dominance. And I think that was exposed during the course of the hearing, of course, that we held in July with the CEO and the documentary evidence that this committee was able to compile during the course of our investigation. Ms. Hubbard, in your prepared testimony, I believe you argue, and I think I'm putting this accurately, that enforcers should unwind illegal mergers that they didn't catch. And you cite Facebook's acquisition of WhatsApp and Instagram as examples of what you believe could be illegal mergers. I wonder if you could expound a bit on why, in your view, antitrust enforcers didn't catch these anti-competitive acquisitions in real time, because I think it's fairly clear from the documentary evidence that we've compiled that it was, in fact, an anti-competitive acquisition. And it was consistent with Facebook's kind of modus operandi, if you will, which Professor Teachout articulates really well in terms of copying competitors, acquiring competitors, or eliminating them.
Thank you for the question. I think in this hearing, we've let the enforcers off the hook a little too lightly. To hear the conversations we've had about the Google DoubleClick merger, for example, and we've said, how could we have foreseen that? All you need to do is read the dissenting statement of Pamela Jones Harbor. She foresaw everything. So who is in the majority matters, okay? If we had 3 Chopras or Slaughters running the FTC right now, we'd be having vastly different enforcement. So people matter. If Pamela Jones Harbor had been in charge, that deal may have not gone through. She was urging for greater scrutiny. So, why did they miss these mergers? I think they were trained in the Chicago school ideology, which has been a failure at enforcing the antitrust laws in a way that protects anybody. It's the consumer welfare standard, but it hasn't protected consumers at all. And that ideology is incredibly narrow. And they look at, oh, Facebook is this kind of a product and Instagram is a photo sharing app. And they don't do any kind of a real thoughtful analysis that, hey, is this a competitor that they're acquiring? I didn't see any of the discussion of, wow, this is a really hard case to win, and so even though we think it's a problem, we're not going to do it. What I saw is they didn't do a thorough enough investigation. They didn't get the documents that your investigation has shown. If any antitrust enforcer was presented with those documents, you need to try to bring that case. Even if you think you might lose, you need to bring that case. So it is a failure. But the good thing is that it's not too late, because there's no rule that you can't unwind an illegal acquisition later in the future. So that should still happen. It's very critically important for our democracy, for elections, for all kinds of the problems that we're seeing that result from Facebook not having any competitive threat because it acquired its top competitors.
Well, thank you. I couldn't agree with you more. And obviously, there's been public reporting, as you know, the FTC is certainly investigating whether Facebook illegally maintained its dominance in the social media market through those acquisitions of 80 some odd companies in the course of 15 years. So in any event, I certainly share your sentiments. And as somebody who previously served in a gubernatorial administration in Colorado prior to coming to Congress, running the state's regulatory department back there, I certainly can attest that personnel is policy in every sense of that phrase. And so your point is a salient one. And I guess I'm running out of time here, but the last question I would have for you, Ms. Hubbard, and to the extent Professor Teachout wishes to opine on this as well. I've certainly read her report with Mr. Stoller in depth, and I think their recommendations are very thoughtful of just what statutory changes, in addition to potentially overturning, of course, the precedents that were referenced by Professor Teachout, to federal antitrust law should Congress pursue to ease challenging dominant firms or rather ease the dominant firms' acquisitions of nascent competitors.
The time of the gentleman has expired, but the witness may answer the question.
Thank you. Yes. So I think when it comes to acquisitions of nascent competitors, we definitely need to reform the standards that are completely broken. But the easiest way would be to go through a bright line rules process for mergers. We could look at the 1968 merger guidelines as a model for how to do that, where it just says if you have a certain amount of market power, you are not allowed to acquire any further companies. And if you want to grow your market power, you need to do it by investing in products and your workers, and you need to grow organically. You're not allowed to do any kind of a merger once you have a certain size. And these clear thresholds would get rid of the burdens on enforcers that make it too hard and too expensive to win mergers. It would also create very clear rules for the marketplace so that everyone knows what's acceptable, and would help, we need to go further than just little tweaks here and there. We need actually bright line rules.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McBath, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for continuing to bring these important measures before the body today. And thank you so much for each of you. We're really glad to be hearing from you today as we continue to examine the antitrust and also the anti-competitive nature of big tech. When I had the opportunity to ask questions of the CEOs of big tech companies, I focused on the harms that were faced by small businesses. I asked Mr. Bezos about Amazon's treatment of third-party sellers, small businesses who want to sell on Amazon. I asked Mr. Cook about developers who want to make their apps available in the App Store, and the users who were disappointed when their favorite apps just suddenly disappeared. In both cases, Amazon and Apple exercise immense control over whose products, whether physical or digital, are available in their marketplaces. And this leaves small businesses beholden to their whims as they try to maintain a business, create jobs, and provide for their own families. After our last hearing, even more Amazon sellers reached out to this committee and to my office with the same similar concerns. Sellers have told us over and over again that they feel that they are dispensable. So, Ms. Teachout, you made recommendations in your testimony about reforms that we could take, reforms that we could make. Do you have anything to add on those reforms that can help third-party sellers or app developers?
Thank you, and thank you for your very powerful questioning. As you saw in response to your questions, the CEOs will always have some reason for kicking off their competitors because it's better for consumers. But it looks from the outside like they are using their platform power to really squeeze and really hurt small businesses. And I just want to add one thing. We are in the middle of a global pandemic where small businesses are facing a true catastrophe. And it is more important than ever that we support those small businesses in this moment during a time when margins are tight, if they're there at all. So the most important thing to protect small businesses is structural separation. The most important thing for those Amazon sellers is that they are able to go to Amazon as a place where they sell their wares but not feel like they are then obliged to go to the feudal lord of Amazon and say, to get prioritization, I will use your advertising. To get prioritization, I will use your fulfillment services. And those sellers are not legitimately fearful that their brilliant creative ideas will be ripped off and then used by Amazon to compete against them. So structural separation, to me, is the simplest and most powerful tool for supporting small businesses at this moment.
Thank you so much for that answer. And Mr. Kadish, do the reforms that you're supporting actually, do they have a risk of unintended consequences? Could you, and if they do, why or why not?
Okay, so I think I actually forgot to turn it off last time, but so I'm 0 for 3 today. Thank you for that question. But I think it's foolish for anyone to say, I have an idea for reform and it's totally costless and there never will be unintended consequences. So that's true. But what I think is also true is when we look at the situation of where the law is, the cost of doing nothing is tremendous. I mean, this committee, in some sense, when we address the question of whether the antitrust laws are in the right position, this committee in a bipartisan way already answered yes. Earlier in this Congress, twice you passed bills directly trying to address the failure of the courts to condemn clearly anti-competitive activity in the healthcare field, both the Pay for Delay and the CREATES Act. Right? Those were much simpler issues than the types of issues that are flowing around with tech. Those were cases involving price, and still the courts are getting them wrong. So I think if we do nothing, what we're saying is the government is no longer concerned about regulating dominant companies, and it's just free reign. Can the reforms have negative consequences? I said yes, but I think that's a decision Congress always makes.
Thank you very much. And one last question for Ms. Hubbard. Of the reforms that you were recommending, which ones do you think will do the most to address the harms that have been faced by these small businesses? As you know, one who's been working in gun safety, I know that there's not one solution to the expansive culture of gun violence, but what do you believe a reform that will do the most effective, efficient, expedient change?
Yeah, I'll have to agree with Professor Teachout her comment earlier about structural separation. It's just the most administrable. It is, a preventative solution that just eliminates the conflicts of interest and creates a playing field that's level. It just doesn't work to have dominant corporations, playing the game and controlling it too, right? They have to do one or the other. And you just can't police every little incident because there are so many opportunities for them to favor their own products and services, and so many opportunities for them to put the thumb on the scale that we just can't even see. It's just not possible to get at all of those through individual enforcement actions, and that's why I think the structural separation, which has been done in American history many times in many industries, is the best solution.
Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding back. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Professor Teachout, I would like you to respond to an argument that we have heard during the course of this investigation, that Congress suddenly becoming active in this antitrust space risks rendering antitrust laws dangerously political, and that somehow our effort to sort of get the policy around antitrust modernized and updated creates some perception that we're politicizing antitrust. I wonder if you'd respond to that argument.
Economic policy and anti-corruption policy are arguably the core jobs of Congress, protecting the people of this country from tyrants and allowing for a thriving economy. There is recent research that Mr. Rahman alluded to showing that corporate concentration is leading to a transfer of as much as $14,000 per year from workers to investors. This is a major driver of inequality. Nobody doubts that labor law is your job, that tax law is your job, that campaign finance law is your job. And when it comes to antitrust and anti-monopoly law is about the country sharing its vision of what a moral, fair, and thriving economy looks like. There is nothing more congressional than antitrust law.
I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you. You said it much more articulately than I could have. Ms. Hubbard, I'd like to now ask you, there obviously is a significant reporting that, and we're all aware that the state attorneys generals, the FTC, and the DOJ are all pursuing antitrust investigations into the major dominant technology platforms, and some reporting that lawsuits may be filed very soon. Some have also suggested that, Congress should just wait to see how these cases turn out before pursuing legislative reform. I, of course, have suggested to them that there are two very different proceedings. One is an enforcement proceeding, which we're not prosecuting an enforcement action, but ours is, as Professor Teachout just mentioned, ours is public policy development, and the urgency of doing our work cannot be overstated, and so of course we shouldn't await those. I just want to be sure that I'm not off course with that thinking.
Right, and as you know, I was at the New York AG's office, and they're part of these investigations, so I still don't think you should wait for them. And the reason is there is so much conduct, so much anti-competitive conduct to go after, that the agencies are just trying to bite off little tiny pieces that they can work on that are just a tiny fraction of the anti-competitive conduct that's going on. So they're not, getting the whole landscape of all the different ways that these companies are abusing their monopoly power to exclude competition. The other thing is that antitrust cases take years. So we have very pressing issues here about small business, about citizens, about democracy, about speech. We need urgent action right now in the middle of this global pandemic. We can't wait 5-10 years for our antitrust case to finish up.
Thank you.
And the last thing is we've seen some strong antitrust cases lately that the judges just completely screw up. I mean, the New York State AG sued to block the Sprint T-Mobile merger. That was a classic antitrust case of 3-2 major competitors. It should have been blocked. The evidence was overwhelming that it would lead to a price increase under the Chicago school theory of consumer welfare, and they still didn't win. So we just can't put this in the hands of the courts. It's too important and too urgent. I do urge those enforcers to carry on and do their job, but we need you as well.
Thank you. And Professor Rahman, in your written statement, you note that tech platforms like Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Apple represent essential infrastructure, just like the railroads, bridges, and telegraph lines of a century ago. And you write about the dangers of unchecked private control over social, economic, and political infrastructure. And I wonder if you could just speak a little more about what that kind of infrastructure and the power that accompanies it means, and why our responsibility in terms of developing good public policy in this context is so important.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chairman. I think, like a lot of the other speakers today have alluded, we're in such a crisis moment right now in our country, and a central piece of this is that if Congress doesn't act, what that means is that we are actually living under the private government, as Professor Teachout said, the private government of these private firms, and the misapplication of law that we're seeing from the courts, right? And so the essential infrastructure is exactly that. It's essential. If we don't update the rules of the road to make sure everybody can actually access that infrastructure, build the businesses, and engage in the social activities that it enables, then we are not creating the kind of economy that we need to be equitable and inclusive, and to create new types of innovation in the future.
And so if I could just ask for all the witnesses, as I kind of review both the testimony at this hearing today, which has been incredibly useful, and your written testimony, it seems as if the reforms that you have all recommended, or some part of these, are kind of in 5 different areas, and I want to be sure I haven't missed one. The first is a change of some presumptions in statutes to shift burdens to parties that both may be engaging in misconduct but also have easier access to the information. 2, this whole notion of separation of lines of business, that's sort of structural change, so we eliminate what Professor Teachout has described as this extraordinary conflict of interest, which is bad for our economy, bad for innovation, bad for a whole range of other things. 3, more rigorous enforcement, which of course we recognize means more resources, staff, and leadership that enthusiastically and creatively promote competition policy and believe in this stuff and will work aggressively. The 4th area is a reversal of a number of court decisions that have either kind of misinterpreted or frankly just changed the intention of Congress as it relates to important competition policy. And then 5th, a set of provisions that may just explicitly prohibit discriminatory behavior. So have I missed, are there other kind of other, and those obviously have some permutations, but are there other general areas that we ought to be looking at in this final part of our investigation in terms of recommendation, or does that, yes, Mr. Baer?
I agree with, I think that aptly summarizes the points. I do think in looking at prohibitions, we also ought to be thinking at forward-looking rules, interoperability, portability, and it may well be we need to invest, whether it's the Federal Trade Commission or a new agency with the authority to do targeted rules that actually will promote competition. So that's kind of an addendum to point 5.
Great, thank you. We'll make that point 6. It deserves its own. Anyone else? Yes, sir, Mr. Kaitis.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Bill Baer just said. I mean, I do think it's really important to think about part of what...
That's why I promoted you back then.
I know. Right. Too often we see when people say the word regulation, right, they have this theory of burdening commerce, where in fact regulations is just a kind of jargon way to say these are the rules of the marketplace.
Right.
And so the FCC, right, the reason, right, they decided at some point that a long-distance monopoly didn't mean you got to have a long monopoly on phones. Right? They said, no, now you got to have interconnection. And I think a lot of the problems we're dealing with, whether it be with any of these companies, is better regulatory rules really will unleash competition and unleash it along the lines we want to see.
And I'm just, with the indulgence of my colleagues, I'm just going to ask Professor Rahman. I think he had his hand up also.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Very quickly, I just add one piece, which is important to clarify the rulemaking authority that the FTC will also need in order to be an effective enforcer going forward of the kinds of issues that we've talked about today. That's a dispute right now, and Congress could help improve that.
Well, I thank you. I have gone way over my time, so I appreciate the indulgence. Before closing today's hearing, though, I'd like to first just thank the chairman of the full committee, Chairman Nadler, who has been an extraordinary supporter of this investigation and an active participant, and it would not have been permitted to proceed in the kind of robust nature that it did without his support. So I want to thank Mr. Nadler for that.
Let me thank Mr. Cicilline for his role in this. Without your efforts, this would not have occurred.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to take a moment as a point of personal privilege to thank the members of the subcommittee on both sides of the aisle who have taken this work seriously, invested extraordinary amounts of time to conduct a really thorough investigation. I am really grateful for that. And also want to take a particular moment of privilege to extend my thanks to our extraordinary staff of the subcommittee for the work that they have done and will continue to do. I have said this many times before, this is a mighty staff of 5 or 6 that has done the work of 30 or more. That is Slade Bond, Lena Khan, Amanda Lewis, Phil Bernbach, Anna Lenhart, and Joe Van Wy, and they have just been extraordinary, and I know all of my colleagues will join me in thanking them. And I think, they have obviously been a really important and indispensable part of this process, and every member on this dais is grateful on both sides of the aisle for all the work that's been put into it. I also want to just take a moment to thank my Chief of Staff, Peter Karafotis, and my Communications Director, Rich Lucetti, for their diligence and commitment during this investigation. And finally, to our witnesses, thank you again. You have all informed this work throughout and given us a lot to think about today, and we are grateful for that. And I'll end by just reminding everyone the reason that this investigation is so important to the future of our country is because our country has a history of this battle between concentrated economic power, monopolies, and democracy. We are seeing that play out in the most extraordinary way and frankly in a dangerous way. And it's incumbent on the Congress of the United States to fulfill our responsibility to make sure our economy works and we safeguard our democracy. And this investigation is a critical part of that. So thank you all. And with that, the hearing is adjourned. I'm sorry, members have 5 legislative days to enter into the record materials and extended remarks.